Contents. Introduction. Strikes in American History 1. Lowell Mill Girls and the Development of American Capitalism 2. Slaves on Strike 3. The 8-Hour Day Strikes 4. The Anthracite Strike in the Progressive State 5. The Bread and Roses Strike 6. The Flint Sit-Down Strike and the New Deal 7. The Oakland General Strike and Cold War America 8. Lordstown and Workers in a Rebellious Age 9. Air Traffic Controllers and the New Assault on Unions 10. Justice for Janitors and Immigrant Unionism. Conclusion. Take Back Power. Acknowledgements. Appendix. 150 Major Events in U.S. Labor History. Notes. Index. Introduction. Strikes in American History. Everyone has a limit. West Virginia teachers had struggled for years to make ends meet, finding themselves the butt of lawmakers' attacks on the budget. They worked in underfunded school districts, in buildings that were falling apart, and for less money than any teachers in the country except for 3 other states. Despite their pathetic salaries, they bought school supplies out of their own pockets. While the teachers had unions, those institutions had struggled to fight back and were tired. West Virginia became a so-called right-to-work state in 2016, allowing workers to opt out of their unions and still receive all the benefits the unions won. This reduced union power, but it did not mean that workers considered themselves powerless. Seeing that the union officers would not lead a counterattack, teachers Emily Comer and Jay O'Neill started a secret Facebook group to organize their fellow workers throughout the state's schools. Comer said, "We thought this would be an easier way to get in touch with people and keep people updated on what was going on." 1. The Facebook group caught on like wildfire, attracting even teachers who had left their union. After Governor Jim Justice signed legislation capping teacher pay well below the cost of living increases, teachers across West Virginia went on strike on February 22, 2018. They didn't want to go on strike. But they felt they had no choice, not if they wanted to be able to teach their students effectively. Rebecca Diamond, an elementary school teacher who spends her weekends working a second job at the local Hardee's, said, "I have lived in West Virginia my whole life. I have 2 children who I don't want to leave the state. What I'm fighting for is the future of West Virginia." 2. She joined 34,000 teachers who put down their chalk and their grading pens and decided to fight for themselves and their students. This strike was illegal. The teachers figured it didn't matter. What did they have to lose when conditions were this bad? West Virginia's parents saw the conditions of their schools. They knew and liked the teachers. Many parents joined the rallies. Huge marches on the state capitol in Charleston by teachers wearing red t-shirts, which has become the symbol of the teachers' movements nationwide, gained national media attention. Some had signs reading, "We'll teach for insurance." 3. Even when an initial agreement convinced leadership to send workers back on the job, teachers from all of the state's 55 counties rejected it and stayed on strike. After 9 days, the teachers won all their major demands. They pushed back against a state proposal to expand the charter schools that undermine public education. Governor Justice agreed to veto all anti-union legislation and create a health care task force with representatives from organized labor. Teachers won a 5% pay raise, very small, but a step in the right direction. Most importantly, as teacher Jay O'Neill said, "We made it so thousands of eyes will be watching everything the task force does. For the fight is nowhere near over." Teachers want a reversal of the corporate tax breaks that have underfunded schools in their state, a problem across the country. They are fighting for themselves, their students, and the future of their state. Though they won their immediate demands, they know that their strike was one skirmish in an endless push and pull between workers and bosses in America. Only a few experiences tie us all together as people. One is that we almost all work or have worked. Whether in a factory, on a farm, at McDonald's, or as an unpaid housewife, work is as much a central experience to human society as eating and family. For the unemployed, the absence of work not only impoverishes but shames and isolates. Work fills the hours of our lives, it provides us with sustenance, and it can give us satisfaction with a job well done. Work is so central to human existence that we hardly know what to do without it. We long toward a well-deserved retirement, but when we get there, Most people have to find new things to do, and that often includes part-time work. The workplace is a site where people struggle for power. Under a capitalist economy such as that of the United States, employers profit by working their employees as hard as they can for as many hours as possible and for as little pay as they can get away with. Their goal is to exploit us. Our lives reflect that reality. Many of us don't enjoy our work. We don't get paid enough. We have to work 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet if we have a job at all. Our bosses treat us like garbage and we don't feel like there is anything we can do about it. We face the threat that machines will replace us. Our jobs have moved overseas, where employers can generate even higher profits. Sometimes a job at Walmart is the only option we have. In our exploitation, we share common experiences with hundreds of millions of Americans, past and present. Our ancestors resisted. So do we, sometimes by forming a union, sometimes by taking a couple extra minutes on our break or by checking social media on the job. All of these activities take back our time and our dignity from our employer. Class struggle, framed through transformations in capitalism, through other struggles for racial and gender justice, and through changes in American politics and society, has played a central role in American history. Future historians will see this in our lives as well. This book places the struggle for worker justice at the heart of American history. This is necessary because we don't teach class conflict in our public schools. Textbooks have little material about workers. As colleges and universities have devalued the study of the past in favor of emphasizing majors in business and engineering, fewer students take any history courses, including in labor history. Labor unions and stories of work are a footnote at best in most of our public discussions about American history. Most history documentaries on television focus on wars, politicians, and famous leaders, not workers. Labor Day was created as a conservative holiday so that American workers would not celebrate the radical international workers' holiday May Day. Yet today, we do not remember our workers on Labor Day like we remember our veterans on Veterans Day. Instead, Labor Day just serves as the end of summer, a last weekend of vacation before the fall begins. That erasure of workers from our collective sense of ourselves as Americans is a political act. Americans shared memory, shaped by teachers, textbook writers, the media, public monuments, and the stories about the past we tell in our own families, churches, and workplaces, too often erases or downplays critical stories of workplace struggle. Instead, our shared history tells myths about our economy meant to undermine class conflict. We are told that we are all middle class, that class conflict is something only scary socialists talk about and has no relevance to the United States today. Our culture deifies the rich and blames the poor for their own suffering. Why don't they pull themselves up by their bootstraps? So many people say. This ignores the fact that millions of Americans never had boots to pull up. Most of us are not wealthy and never will be wealthy. We are workers, laboring for a few rich and powerful people, mostly white men who are the sons and grandsons of other rich white men. We have a hierarchical society that has used propaganda to get Americans to believe everyone is equal. We are not equal. The law routinely favors the rich, the white, and the male. During the 20th century, workers fought and died to solve some of these problems, even though white men still benefited more than women or people of color. Workers formed unions, joined them by the millions, and convinced the government to pressure companies to negotiate with them. Unfortunately, the period of union success ended in the 1970s. So did the rising tide for American workers that created the middle class. With the decimation of unions, the fall of the middle class and the evisceration of the working class have followed. Politicians talk about the middle class during elections, but they too often pursue policies that increase inequality and give power to the rich. This has transformed the fundamentals of the American dream. The idea of getting a job and staying with it your whole life, working hard to feed your family and educate your children, and then retiring with dignity is gone. Now, we are expected to take on massive student debt, enter an uncertain job market, and change jobs every few years, all the while being told by our parents and the media that we should stop eating avocado toast and instead buy a house, as if a $7 appetizer and not $50,000 in student loan debt is why young people suffer financial instability. Pensions are dead, and the idea of retiring seems impossible even for many baby boomers, who have significant consumer debt and shaky finances as they reach their later years. We cannot fight against pro-capitalist mythology in American society if we do not know our shared history of class struggle. This book reconsiders American history from the perspective of class struggle, not by erasing the other critical parts of our history, the politics, the social change, and the struggles around race and gender, but rather by demonstrating how the history of worker uprisings shines a light on these other issues. Some of these strikes fought for justice for all. Sometimes they made America a better place and gave us things we may take for granted today, such as the weekend and the minimum wage. But we also should not romanticize strikes. Some workers went on strike to keep workplaces all white. Sometimes strikes backfire and hurt workers in the end. Working Americans do not always agree with each other. Race, gender, religion, region, ethnicity, and many other identities divide us. Just because a Mexican immigrant and a fourth-generation Italian-American work in the same place does not mean that they like each other or see eye to eye on any issue, including their own union, if they have one. Taking a hard look at the history of strikes helps us in the present. This book argues for two interlocking necessities for workers to succeed in the past, present, and future. First, workers have to organize collectively to fight employers. Through American history, workers have fought to make their jobs better paid, fought for the right to negotiate a contract with their employer, fought to feed their children or have the chance to send them to college, fought for a completely new society that valued work as it deserved. Like the Chicago Teachers Union in 2012, workers of the past 200 years also had to strike to win their struggles. Strikes take place when workers collectively decide to stop working in order to win their goals. Usually that happens with a labor union, which is an organization that workers create to represent them collectively. In the United States, this has usually meant the strikers have the aim of the union winning a written contract from the employer that lays out the rules of work and gives workers set wages, working hours, and benefits. But strikes happen with or without unions. They can be spontaneous acts by workers, paid or unpaid, with their union's support or without it, when they throw down their tools or their wash rags or their chalk and they walk off the job for whatever reason they want. Strikes are special moments. They shut down production, whether of manufacturing cars or manufacturing educated citizens. The strike, the withholding of our labor from our bosses, is the greatest power we have as workers. As unions have weakened in recent decades, we have far fewer strikes today than we did 40 years ago. During the 1970s, there were an average of 289 major strikes per year in the United States. By the 1990s, that fell to 35 per year. In 2003, there were only 13 major strikes. 5 When a strike like the CTU action takes place, it forces people who claim to support the working class to announce which side they're on. Do they really believe in workers' rights, or will they side with employers if a subway strike blocks their commute to work or a teacher's strike forces them to find something to do with their children for the day? Strikes are moments of tremendous power precisely because they raise the stakes, bringing private moments of poverty and workplace indignity into the public spotlight. And unless you are a millionaire boss, we are all workers with a tremendous amount in common with other workers, if we only realize that all of us, farm workers and teachers, insurance agents and construction workers, graduate students and union staffers, face bad bosses, financial instability, and the desperate need for dignity and respect on the job. We might like to believe that if all workers got together and acted for our rights, we could win whatever we want. In theory, if every worker walked off the job, that might happen. Unfortunately, real life does not work that way. Given that we are divided by race, gender, religion, country of origin, sexuality, and many other factors, class identity will never become a universal sign of solidarity. Employers know this and act to divide us upon these bases. For most of American history, the government has served the interests of wealthy employers over those of everyday workers like you and me, sometimes even using the military against us. At the local, state, and national levels, employers have far greater power than workers to implement their agenda, especially unorganized workers who lack a union. Therefore, in addition to worker action, organizers and union leaders have discovered a second requirement for success. Workers have to neutralize the government-employer alliance. After decades of struggle, in the 1930s, a new era of government passed labor legislation that gave workers the right to organize, the minimum wage, and other pillars of dignified work for the first time. While employers' power never waned in the halls of government, the growing power of unions neutralized the worst corporate attacks until the 1980s. Since then, the decline of unions and a revived, aggressive lobby attempting to drive unions to their death have rolled back many of our gains. Once again, we live in a country where the government conspires with employers to make our work lives increasingly miserable. Unions are the only institution in American history to give working people a voice in political life. This is precisely why corporations and conservative politicians want to eliminate them. There is simply no evidence from American history that unions can succeed if the government and employers combine to crush them. All the other factors are secondary. The structure of a union, how democratic it is, how radical its leaders or the rank and file are, their tactics. The potent and often interlocking strategies of the state and bosses build a tremendous amount of power against workers. That was true in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it is true under the Trump administration. Workers were and are denied basic rights to organize, income inequality is rampant, and the future of unions seems hopeless. Workers and their unions have to be as involved in politics as they are in organizing if they are to create conditions by which they can win. To stop involvement with the two-party political system would be tantamount to suicide. Having friends in government, or at least not having enemies there, makes all the difference in the history of American workers. In Donald Trump, we face the most racist and misogynistic president in a century, a fascist Islamophobe who has demonstrated his utter contempt for the Constitution and the values that have made the United States the best it can be, even if it was never great for many of its citizens. Trump won in 2016 in part because he tapped into white Americans' anxiety about their unstable economic futures. Video footage from Carrier's announcement that it would close its Indiana heating and air conditioning manufacturing plant to move its production to Mexico touched home for millions of Americans who do not see a path to a better future. For them, the American dream is dead. Of course, African American, Asian American, Native American, Middle Eastern, and Latino workers also share those economic anxieties. But as has happened so often throughout American history, Trump managed to divide workers by race, empowering white people to blame workers of color for their problems instead of pointing a finger at who is really responsible for our economic problems: capitalists. Capitalism is an economic system developed to create private profits. Within that broader definition, there are many forms of capitalism, some with socialist tendencies to ensure that the benefits of the economy are distributed relatively equally throughout all of society. In the modern United States, business and the government have dedicated themselves to a more fundamentalist version that uses the state to promote profit and keep workers subjugated under employer control. That has led to the income inequality that defines modern society. Whether some form of capitalism can work for everybody is a question people have debated for nearly 2 centuries. Some radicals reject capitalism entirely as a system that will never treat workers fairly. Others believe the state, businesses, and unions can all work together to create a form of capitalism where everyone benefits. We should be debating what the future of American and global capitalism looks like, or whether we should replace it entirely. I argue that at the very least we can use the government to create equitable laws and regulations to ensure that everyone lives a dignified life under a broadly capitalist economy. But that can only happen when workers reject the fundamentalist capitalist propaganda, such as from Ayn Rand and Fox News, and instead stand up for the rights not only of themselves, but of their friends, families, and co-workers. Solidarity is the answer for the future, which means sacrificing for others as they sacrifice for you. The extent that we will stand up for the rights of others, including at the workplace, will determine whether we will continue to see growing inequality and political instability in our world, or we will see the world get better in our lifetimes. This book focuses on 10 major strikes in American history to tell the story of the United States through an emphasis on class and worker struggle. Combined, they weave a tale of a nation that promised life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but that routinely denied that to workers, whether slave or free, men or women, black or white. They tell a story of a nation divided by race, gender, and national origin, as well as by class. They place work at the center of American history. This book sees the struggles for the dignity of workers, the rights of people of color, and the need to fight racism, misogyny, and homophobia as part of the same struggle. Each chapter centers on one strike that accounts for about 1/3 of the chapter. The rest of the chapter places that strike in context of the broader issues affecting Americans at the time. The first chapter, on the Lowell Mill Girls' strikes of the 1830s and 1840s, demonstrates how the Industrial Revolution transformed life for the new nation. Chapter 2, on slave self-emancipation, establishes the centrality of slave labor in American history and shows how slaves themselves helped win the Civil War for the Union, even if racism undermined their economic freedom after the war. The third chapter, on the 1886 8-hour-day strikes, explores how workers responded to the rapid growth of capitalism that created a shocking world of inequality and exploitation after the Civil War. Chapter 4, on the 1902 anthracite coal strike in Pennsylvania, explains the central role of the government in deciding the fate of a strike, with both great possibilities and great peril for workers. Chapter 5 examines the Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts, in 1912 as a window into those fighting for an alternative to capitalism entirely. The sixth chapter investigates the Flint sit-down strike of 1937 to demonstrate what workers can win when conditions and organizing allow them to elect politicians who will help them, and how small numbers of brave people can transform the world. Chapter 7 examines the Oakland General Strike of 1946 to show how workers won a fair share of the economic pie after World War II, but also how fears of radicalism and unions' inability to organize non-union parts of the nation laid the groundwork for the repeal of labor rights later in the 20th century. Chapter 8 focuses on the Lordstown, Ohio, auto workers' strike of 1972 as a window into the tumultuous years of the 1960s and 1970s. Chapter 9 surveys the air traffic controllers' strike of 1981 and how President Ronald Reagan reoriented the American government to crush unions instead of acting as a neutral arbiter between unions and employers, laying the groundwork for the attack on labor that continues today. Finally, Chapter 10 discusses the justice for janitors' actions in American cities during the late 1980s and early 1990s, focusing on the rise of immigration and how unions transformed from opposing immigration to being on the front lines of fighting President Trump's attacks on immigrants today. We all want to live the American dream. That can happen only if we combine organizing and solidarity with electing politicians who will fight for us instead of for out employers. Getting into the street to stand up for our rights must play a central role in these struggles. We cannot rely on others to fight for us. We have to do it for ourselves, in the streets and at the ballot box, at our workplaces and in our homes. The strike is the best weapon we have as everyday people to win our rights. Taken together, these strikes tell a broader story of workers in the scope of American history that, I hope, inspires you to fight for justice in your own life, just as so many people have done in the past and continue to do today. A better tomorrow is possible, but only if you demand it. 1. Lowell Mill Girls and the Development of American Capitalism. Outside of the very rich, everyone is a worker. When Christopher Columbus stumbled across the Americas in 1492, he had specific ideas about work, who would do it, and who would benefit. So did the European nations that followed him, Spain and Portugal, France and England. Europeans colonized the Americas to get rich, and that would happen through other people doing work for them. In most colonies, they would enslave Native Americans and then Africans. Conquest, slavery, dispossession, and racism have defined much of American history, creating the inequalities we face today. Later chapters of this book will return to these issues repeatedly. However, to tell American history through 10 strikes, we need to examine the exception in American colonization. In New England, a different type of colonist arrived with a different type of labor system. Puritans, a Protestant separatist group seeking to reform the Church of England, settled in relatively close-knit communities revolving around their churches. The land of New England was rocky and soil poor. This led to a work culture centered around small farming and artisanship. The Puritans had little objection to slavery, and some New England colonists did own African slaves, but the economic system did not produce the wealth required for large-scale slavery such as in Virginia or Jamaica. New England was an economic backwater. Logging and fishing were its important economic contributions to the British colonial project. As the English colonies moved toward independence in the 18th century, the economic basis of New England changed little. Growing cities, particularly Boston, created slightly more wealth, but this was still a region of small farms. But this geography, with a dense population and significant water sources close to large ports, paid off by 1800, with the Industrial Revolution transforming American work forever. 1. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the mid-18th century, when small-scale manufacturing underwent a radical transformation with the development of new technology that used water power to generate energy that moved machines, in the process shifting work from people's homes into factories. Mechanized cotton spinning, with the development of the power loom, drastically increased the productivity of a single worker. Better technologies to produce iron rapidly lowered its cost, and the development of steam power provided energy sources to run the new factories. The British, realizing the enormous economic advantages these new technologies provided, banned their export and even limited the foreign travel of those familiar with the processes. 2. But the British could not keep their technology under wraps. Americans, wanting to compete with their former motherland in the years after the American Revolution severed those ties, looked to build factories of their own. More than anyone else, Samuel Slater, a British factory worker who migrated to the United States with a memory full of how English mills worked, made this happen. He made a deal with a Rhode Island investor named Moses Brown, who wanted to replicate the British factory system. By 1793, Slater had a fully operational factory in Pawtucket, and American textile production was on the precipice of a revolution. 3. That revolution required a second technological advancement, the cotton gin. Invented by Eli Whitney, this simple machine could separate cotton seeds from the boll where they grew far faster than human hands could. This allowed for the mass production of cotton on southern plantations to feed the ever more powerful textile mills of New England. It meant the transition from agricultural to industrial labor in the North and the rapid expansion and intensification of slavery in the South to produce the cotton. The cotton gin went far to create the 19th century American economy and sharpened the divides between work and labor in different regions of the United States, problems that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Its impact still shapes the global cotton and textile industries today. 4. For New England, mass production meant child labor in the mills. Children worked during the 18th century, usually on their parents' farms, but sometimes as apprentices to craftsmen in cities. Benjamin Franklin, for instance, worked as his brother's apprentice in a print shop in Boston starting at the age of 12, before he ran away to Philadelphia, eventually becoming one of the most important founding fathers. Slater had started working in a British mill as a child and hired children in his own mills. Child labor scaled up with the factory system. It placed thousands of people in cities with no care to their living or working conditions. Americans feared importing the filth, dire poverty, and crime of the British industrial city along with its factory system. Those fears quickly became justified. The entire labor system of the American economy soon revolved around an ever more exploitable labor force, both in the North and in the South, setting the stage for the justice movements that would slowly transform the lives of working people throughout American history. 5. By 1815, 140 mills had opened within 30 miles of Providence, employing 26,000 people. The mill owners demanded incredible levels of work from their new, young laborers. Farmers labored hard, but they controlled their own time. Factory owners demanded punctuality and submission to the clock. Samuel Slater enforced his 72-hour workweek by firing laborers who resisted. And resist they did. As early as 1817, mill workers possibly invented the idea of overtime by demanding extra pay for even 5 minutes of extra work over their allotted 72 hours. 6. With the Industrial Revolution, young workers began moving to the mill towns from the farms where they had labored, turning the raw products of nature into economic survival. These children often faced physical punishment. By the late 1830s, factory overseers faced criminal charges for the brutal beatings of child workers. It became the American version of the British factory town nightmare. These children could not attend school, as Seth Luther, a former carpenter turned educational reformer, said of his tour of Rhode Island mill towns in the 1830s. In Pawtucket there are at least 500 children who scarcely know what a school is. And to add to the darkness of the picture, in all the mills which the inquiries of the committees have been able to reach, books, pamphlets, and newspapers are absolutely prohibited. 7. The factory system and cotton gin began the industrial age in the United States. New technology advanced it. Robert Fulton's commercial adaptation of the steamboat in 1807 began a revolution in transportation and communication. Using steam energy to move upriver meant the new industrial goods could easily travel anywhere in the country. The completion of the Erie Canal in 1825 magnified this revolutionary moment. The canal was an engineering marvel that connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River using an ingenious system of locks that allowed boats to travel up and downstream, connecting two great waterways in what was then the American West with the East. The sheer size of this project awed people around the world. It lowered consumer costs and allowed farmers in places such as Ohio to send their goods cheaply by boat to New York instead of all the way downriver to New Orleans and then to New York, which itself was far less expensive than dragging the goods across the barely passable roads of early America. The canal had enormous impacts on the future of American work, including spurring ever greater industrialization, helping cement the Great Lakes region as a center of American industrialization, and ensuring New York would be the long-term capital of American commerce. 8. Building the Erie Canal also killed 1,000 workers. Workers' lives were cheap, and employers did not concern themselves with safety. Many died from the epidemic diseases that periodically ravaged the United States in this era. But the use of gunpowder to blow through rock also blew up or crushed a lot of workers. Canal wall collapses buried workers. Workers fell to their deaths building the locks and aqueducts. Exhausted, Orrin Harrison fell asleep resting against a beam on a lock. He fell into 8 feet of water, where his legs were caught in the lock's gates, and he drowned. This was just a standard event, happening with very little notice. The death toll rose daily from these sorts of incidents. 9. The sheer brutality of the labor made most native-born Americans avoid working on the canal, so it became a prime job site for the nation's growing numbers of immigrants from Wales and Ireland. Throughout American history, foreign workers have entered the United States to escape economic desperation or political and religious oppression in their home countries. The United States attracted significant Irish immigration after an 1817 famine, exploding during the famous Great Famine in the 1840s. Employers quickly learned they could import cheap, exploitable labor rather than improve working conditions for native-born laborers. When early 19th century immigrants arrived from Ireland or Wales and found the conditions terrible, their American dream was shattered. Welsh immigrant William Thomas found work on the Erie Canal, but when he rode back home, he despaired of the horrible conditions he faced and urged his friends not to repeat his mistakes. "I beg all my old neighbors not to think of coming here, as they would spend more coming here than they think. My advice to them is to love their district and stay there." Thomas considered returning to Wales, although we do not know if he did. 10. The Irish took the most difficult and dangerous jobs in the pre-Civil War North. Conflict arose between native-born workers and immigrant workers, foreshadowing how race and immigration would block worker solidarity throughout American history. Anti-Irish agitation later led to the Know Nothing Party, a major political movement of the early 1850s dedicated to ending Irish immigration. 11. The introduction and development of the railroad in the United States during the 1820s only increased the death tolls of early industrial work. Fast trains, poor safety precautions, and many moving parts made riding the early trains deadly for the passengers. European travelers constantly noted the intense dangers of American trains versus those in their home nations. Most early trains even lacked effective brakes. Working for the railroads was even more dangerous than riding the trains. The work was associated with working-class cultures of manliness and risk-taking, creating an atmosphere of independence and indifference to safety from both workers and bosses. Supervision was light and working or production standards non-existent. 12. The injury or death of thousands of rail workers tore apart families. They began seeking compensation for their losses in the courts. Did employers have legal responsibility for dead or maimed workers? Or did the workers take on the risk themselves by agreeing to such a job? On October 30, 1837, Nicholas Farwell, a train engineer toiling for the Boston and Worcester Railroad Corporation, fell off a train after a switchman made a mistake. The train ran over his hand, forcing an amputation. In an era without workers' compensation or any economic safety net, Farwell had no guarantee that he could work or eat. He sued the company for $10,000. In the 1842 case of Farwell v. Boston and Worcester Railroad Corporation, Massachusetts Chief Justice Lemuel Shaw claimed that Farwell agreed to take on the risk of work by laboring for the railroad. He called the $2 a day. Farwell made a premium for the risk which he thus assumes. Shaw might sue his fellow servant, who made the mistake that led to his fall, but the company was immune to lawsuits of this kind. 13. The Farwell case was part of a larger transformation in the American legal code to facilitate employer rights at the expense of everyone else. Citizens sued textile mills for damming rivers that ended age-old fish runs people upstream relied upon for food. The courts consistently found in favor of the new corporations, claiming these businesses promoted progress in the justification for the court's decisions. This led to corporations with the right to pollute at will and timber companies with the right to destroy the stream banks that farmers owned, with courts backing up corporate domination of anyone who got in the way of their growth. 14. Farwell directly led to tens of thousands of dead workers and millions who suffered from tuberculosis, lead poisoning, electrocution, severed limbs, hair ripped from workers' scalps after being caught in machinery, suffocation in coal mines, and other workplace hazards and diseases in a nation where corporations had no responsibility for their workers' safety and health. Workers might receive compensation from companies, but the average for the 149 workers injured on the Boston and Maine Railroad in 1891 was all of $21. The roots of capitalist exploitation go to the system's very beginning. 15. Early railroad unions sought to provide some benefits upon injury or death. Labor organizations formed soon after 1800 to promote the collective interest of fellow workers, usually laborers who did the same job across different workplaces or sometimes all the workers in a given workplace. During the 1830s, perhaps 44,000 Americans were union members, around 2.5% of the non-agricultural free labor force. The center of American unionism was New York City, with perhaps 11,500 union members out of an overall population of 218,000.16. However, those unions could do little to battle a poorly regulated economy that impoverished them. During the Panic of 1837, up to 1 out of 3 workers in New York lost their job. 17. Economic dislocation combined with industrialization to undermine the master craftsman and apprentice system that had long dominated urban work relations. Shoemakers, coopers, ironworkers, and other shop workers valued their independence, controlling their time and pace of work. The Industrial Revolution had no place for these inefficiencies, and companies began eroding workers' independence. Class consciousness, or the belief that workers should band together for mutual interest based upon their status as workers in an exploitative economic system, slowly developed. Strikes, or turnouts, as they were called, were rare in the early 19th century. 18 in 1827, workers at Samuel Slater's mills went on strike when he cut their pay rates, an action built upon years of growing grievances, but the strike failed. 19 in 1831. Providence workers started a movement for a 10-hour day that caught fire across the factory towns of Rhode Island and Massachusetts. Factory owners responded with mass firings and considered demanding the state militia protect them from this supposedly radical threat. Yet throughout early 1832, machinists, mule spinners in the textile factories, and carpenters struck, refusing to work more than 10 hours. But poverty, the fact that many of them were children supporting their families, and intimidation largely killed this early workers' movement by the middle of 1832. Such movements continued well into the 1840s, with a big push in 1844 by the building trades in Fall River, Massachusetts, that led to the creation of the New England Workingmen's Association later that year. The association combined working-class organizing with the reform movements of the era to stress both individual morality and mutual aid in promoting workers' rights. 20. In 1835, coal heavers in Philadelphia walked off the job and 20,000 other workers in the city's General Trades Union joined them. This early, general strike, included everyone from those coal heavers to people who worked for the city government. The strikers won a 10-hour day, which still meant that the workers were on the job from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., with 2-hour-long meal breaks. Even early union victories meant hard labor and long days. 21 Like these coal heavers, most workers in the nascent industrial economy saw wage labor as a specifically male realm. Men felt that the growth of the market economy challenged their ability to provide for their families, and they acted politically as workers to fight that. The Loco Focos, an 1830s splinter movement of the Democratic Party in New York, fought to bring down the price of food, arguing that men laboring to take care of their families had moral authority to fight for the rights of workers, which built on 2 decades of New York workers organizing for a family wage and the right to spend time away from their jobs with their families. 22 Yet the idea of the single family wage, where a man earned enough to support his family, was already more myth than reality. Women worked in all sorts of occupations to support themselves and their families in the early industrial economy, not only in unpaid labor on farms, but as sex workers by the thousands in cities such as New York, as domestic servants, and in factories. 23 In fact, women would lead the way in protesting unfair working conditions as the Industrial Revolution transformed the nation. The Mill Girls Strike. In 1822, textile manufacturers started an experimental town in Lowell, Massachusetts. They wanted to avoid the conditions of the hellish British textile cities. Visitors to the British city of Manchester repeatedly expressed shock both at its rapid growth and the foul, dreadful, degraded lives of the people laboring there. Americans wrote books defining the United States as superior to Britain precisely because their nation did not have these cities. Yet Americans also wanted the industrial expansion and money that the textile mills brought. 24 Lowell's founders wanted to prove that factories and respectable labor could coexist. They recruited young New England farm women to work, have a bit of an adventure, and live under supervision. The short-term nature of the work, to be undertaken before the women became wives and mothers, meant the avoidance of a permanently degraded working class. Employers housed the so-called mill girls in boarding houses under the watchful eyes of older women. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and other writers gave talks to the workers. The mill girls produced their own magazines, took classes, and, in the eyes of the factory owners, prepared themselves nicely for marriage while producing profit for their employer. The town's founders hoped they'd created a model for labor in the industrializing age. 25. Young women came to the mills for a number of reasons. Mary Hall made $115 in 8 months in 1834, more than enough for her to live on comfortably. Harriet Hanson Robinson moved to Lowell as a child and found upward mobility in the mills, rising into skilled positions before leaving when she married at the age of 24. Sally Rice left her village of Somerset, Vermont, in 1838 and worked in mills in New York and Connecticut to make enough money to earn a dowry and get married, which she finally did in 1847. Sisters or cousins came together, while many workers came and went periodically, going to the mills when they needed money and back to the farms when they fell ill or got homesick. 26. These women were used to hard farm work, but the factories were notably unpleasant. They were hot and humid to keep the cotton fibers workable and reduce fires. Enormous glass windows allowed sun to pour in on the hottest days of the year. The machines were loud in a way that's difficult to imagine today unless you were a factory worker yourself. They worked 12 or 14-hour days, 6 days a week, locked up in that factory tending those machines minute after minute, day after day, month and month. Historians have argued that working-class Americans began to see the natural environment as something romantic during this era, something to escape to rather than tame. Reflecting the transcendentalist thinkers who spoke to them, the workers wrote longingly of the beauty of the forests and fields of New England. A striking transformation from the matter-of-fact style of writing about the New England land before the factories opened. 27. It did not take long before the mill girls moved from intellectual pursuits during their limited free time to political organizing. They began demanding better conditions in the factories, and since they came from respectable families, they had the social status to demand a response. The first strike among textile workers was in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, in 1824 when Samuel Slater reduced wages and extended hours. Male and female workers fought together, the mills closed, and Slater agreed to compromise. 28 Occasional strikes took place over the next decade. In February 1834, Lowell saw its first strike. 800 women quit work to fight against a reduction in their piece rates, the wages paid per piece of cloth produced. The mill girls held organizing meetings to resist the pay cut. When one employer fired an organizer, the women walked out and the strike began. It failed quickly, with the mills returning to near-capacity production within a week. Yet, this early effort was an important pioneering stand against exploitation. In a statement titled, "Union is Power," the workers connected their struggles to their ancestors resisting oppression from the English, whether Puritans escaping religious oppression or fighting King George III's taxes during the American Revolution. We circulate this paper wishing to obtain the names of all who imbibe the spirit of our patriotic ancestors, who preferred privation to bondage, and parted with all that renders life desirable and even life itself to procure independence for their children. They rejected the assertion that employers could exploit them at will and demanded an equal say in the burgeoning industrial economy. 29. In 1836, the workers walked off the job once more, again protesting a reduction in their earnings, in this case due to an increase in the cost of room and board in the boarding houses. Business was booming, but the companies sought to capture all the profits instead of sharing them with the workers. One of the strikers was Harriet Hanson Robinson, who remembered, "Cutting down the wages was not their only grievance, nor the only cause of this strike. Hitherto the corporations had paid 25 cents a week towards the board of each operative, and now it was their purpose to have the girls pay the sum, and this, in addition to the cut in the wages, would make a difference of at least $1 a week." It was estimated that as many as 12 or 1,500 girls turned out, and walked in procession through the streets. They had neither flags nor music, but sang songs, a favorite, but rather inappropriate, one being a parody on, "I Won't Be a Nun. Oh, isn't it a pity, such a pretty girl as I should be sent to the factory to pine away and die? Oh, I cannot be a slave. I will not be a slave. For I'm so fond of liberty that I cannot be a slave." 30. Probably 1,500 to 2,000 workers went on strike, up to 1/3 of the workforce. Unlike in 1834, they kept up the struggle for several months, making it impossible for the mills to run at full capacity. They would turn off all the machines in a given room before walking out, effectively shutting down an entire mill. At least 2 mills gave in and revoked the boarding house rate increases. 31. Lowell was not the only site of these strikes. In Paterson, New Jersey, more than 2,000 workers from 20 mills, largely young girls, walked off the job on July 3, 1835. Their workday was 13.5 hours. For this, they made $2 a week. Employers fined workers for mistakes or not working hard enough. The mills also opened a company store and forced workers to shop there. Some of the tradesmen in Paterson, including the fathers of some of the mill workers, had organized earlier that year and successfully won a 10-hour day. The Paterson mill workers decided to make this their prime demand, with the fines, wage withholding, company store, and pay as less central issues. Support from workers around the region allowed the strike to continue for nearly 2 months. Donations came in from workers in Newark and New York City, and the Paterson Association for the Protection of the Working Class formed to organize relief. Workers in Newark created an investigating committee to look into the working conditions in the cotton mills, described as more congenial to the climate of the autocrat of all the Russias than to this land of the free and home of the brave. Employers refused to negotiate and did bust the strike, but only after giving in to several of the workers' demands, including reducing the workday to 12 hours Monday through Friday and 9 hours on Saturday, a 69-hour work week. That's still a very long week, but it also meant about 12 hours returned to workers each week, a significant improvement in their lives. 32. The Lowell mill girls did not win their strike either, but they continued fighting. As the mills began to hire men as well as women, male and female workers tried to find common ground. In 1844, a petition demanding a 10-hour day was signed by 300 mill workers of both genders. In Worcester, Massachusetts, a similar petition simply stated, 10 hours per day as a day's labor for all adult persons. 33. The 10-hour day became a major fighting point for the Lowell workers, especially as employers sped up the work, increasing the rate of the machines without hiring new workers. One worker had the speed of her 2 looms increased by 70% over a 2-year period, with her wages only increasing 16%. 34. Stopping the speed-up was much harder than limiting the number of hours workers toiled, a concrete demand that compensated workers rather than limiting production. Huldah Stone wrote, "Is it necessary that men and women should toil and labor 12, 16 and even 18 hours, to obtain mere sustenance of their physical natures?" 35. For Stone and her fellow workers, the answer was clearly no. But the conditions of work continued to decline. Between 1840 and 1854, the workload of spinners at the Hamilton Corporation in Lowell more than doubled, while wages declined. 36. Some of the mill girls developed into long-term fighters for economic justice. In 1835, Sarah Bagley, age 28, began working in the mills. She quickly became politically aware and started working to reform the conditions. She asked the Workingmen's Convention in 1844, when "Our rights are trampled upon and we appeal in vain to our legislators, what shall we do but appeal to the people? Shall not our voice be heard and our rights acknowledged here? Shall it be said again to the daughters of New England, that they have no political rights and are not subject to legislative action?" 37. Bagley, who held to many of the gender norms of her day, saw women as taking a subservient role to men in the overall labor movement, but she also saw them as agents who needed to stand up for themselves. Bagley believed women should operate within the women's sphere of society that Victorian-era reformers had created by the 1840s, staying at home if possible, but given that the reality of factory work degraded the morals of women, they also needed to speak out to protect themselves. 38. Bagley helped found the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association in 1844. Other mill towns such as Manchester, New Hampshire, formed their own branches of the Female Labor Reform Association. Bagley led a campaign to demand that the Massachusetts government hold hearings about conditions in the mills. By 1845, 1,150 Lowell workers had signed petitions to demand the hearings, about 3/4 of them women. 39. On February 13, 1845, Bagley's organizing paid off and the state of Massachusetts held hearings on reducing the workday in the state's textile mills to 10 hours a day. 6 women testified, including Bagley. She said, "The chief evil, so far as health is concerned, is the shortness of time allowed for meals. The next evil is the length of time employed." 40. Bagley and others would use their perceived vulnerability as women to make the 10-hour argument. Said E.S., a mill girl, a shorter workday would lead to the improvement of the condition of women in particular, that would allow them to become educated and then become better mothers. 41. Bagley built on these arguments by arguing that Sunday work undermined women's morality because they could not go to church. 42. But in 1846, the Massachusetts legislature voted to reject the workers' demands. As in the Farwell case, Massachusetts prioritized the desires of employers over any form of social justice. However, the owners did agree to reduce the hours to 11 a day in 1853 as the women continued pressuring them. States did respond to pressure to pass 10-hour legislation, including New Hampshire in 1847 and Rhode Island in 1853, but these laws were ineffective and not enforced, a major problem in this era when even the federal government was small and weak. 43. The long hours and ever harder work undermined the mill girls' culture. The Lowell Offering, the main journal of the mill girls, stopped publication in 1845 because the women who wrote it quit as the work became ever more intense and degrading. 44. The response of the factory owners to the mill girls agitating was to find more easily exploitable workers. The Great Famine meant 780,000 new immigrants to the United States from Ireland in the 1840s alone, with another 914,000 following in the 1850s. These workers were in no condition to turn down hard industrial labor. Any work was better than starvation at home. During the 1850s, Lowell employers shifted decisively toward immigrant labor. By the early 1860s, the Lowell operators no longer had any illusions about a model labor force. They gave up on supervising their workers' behavior or treating them with paternalist concern, with 9 companies stopping production in 1862 and throwing 10,000 workers out of a job. 45. It's possible that the Lowell experiment never really had much chance of working, given the lack of government-mandated employment standards and an ever more competitive market with factories seeking to undercut each other. But eliminating what we can call a privileged labor class, workers with options and access to political levers, proved incredibly profitable for the textile industry. Free labor in a capitalist nation. The Industrial Revolution transformed women's work outside the factory as well, both in terms of personal cleanliness and modern housework. Americans still lived basically medieval lives. Bathing was rare, farm animals lived in close proximity with people, and the separation of spaces we find in modern homes was largely unknown. The economic and social upheavals of the Industrial Revolution spawned a series of reform movements based in New England and New York, including abolitionism, temperance, religious revivals, the creation of new religions such as Mormonism, the public education movement, creating solitary confinement in prisons so that prisoners could theoretically reflect on their moral failings, and more. Each of these attempted to make sense of a new and rapidly changing world. 46. New middle-class values created the modern definition of housework, which became unpaid women's work. In 1841, Catherine Beecher, from the nation's foremost reformer family, published a treatise on domestic economy, the first major tract to promote the idea of cleanliness and housekeeping as specifically women's work that would civilize men and raise proper children. She believed housework was a legitimate profession and thus women should be educated for it as they would be educated for teaching. Her book attempted to teach these qualities to American women. She focused on practical advice around childcare, cleaning, training servants, cooking, sewing, nursing, gardening, and other skills a proper middle-class woman needed to create a new generation of moral Americans. She called for a redesign of houses to create an architecture of cleanliness. Every room would have a fireplace, a kitchen needed a good sink, and homes needed wells or cisterns nearby for the vastly increased amount of laundry required to be clean. She emphasized bathing and rejected the common idea that dirt was healthy. By the 1870s, her ideas had caught on, creating new forms of women's work and giving working women what was essentially a second unpaid job when they returned home from earning wages. 47. Northern men responded to the Industrial Revolution by promoting the idea of free labor, wherein workers would direct themselves in productive labor that created economic and therefore political independence, allowing white males to govern the nation as a collective body with similar interests. Free labor would create a white male democracy that would put small farmers, skilled workers, employers, and entrepreneurs in a society of relative equality, albeit one that excluded people of color and women of all races. Despite the stresses factory workers faced, this dream remained prominent well into the late 19th century. But the system of slavery expanding across the southern United States, as slaveholders' demands for power grew ever more strident, increasingly seemed to threaten white northern free labor. More Northerners saw a South dominated by an elite plantation class with slaves and widespread poverty among everyday white farmers. 48. This was at the core of why Republicans opposed slavery after the party's 1854 founding. While abolitionists who called for the immediate end of slavery because it was immoral did exist, they were a minority even in the Republican Party until well after the Civil War began in 1861. Rather, slavery threatened the white male democracy of the northern free laborer because a system of forced black labor left no place in society for the middling whites who made up northern society. The expansion of slavery into the territories recently acquired by the United States, through war against Mexico and Native American peoples, further threatened the future of white male democracy by cutting off the land and labor seen as necessary to its continuation. As one Iowa Republican stated, "Slavery is a foul political curse upon the institutions of our country. It is a curse upon the poor, free, laboring white man." 49. Abraham Lincoln's opposition to slavery was similarly based upon the opportunities it denied to white men. He stated, "Men, with their families, work for themselves on their farms, in their houses, and in their shops, taking the whole product to themselves, and asking no favors of capital on the one hand nor of hired laborers or slaves on the other." 50. Industrial capitalism would later make this ideology of control over one's labor antiquated, but it drove northern white opposition to slavery and continued as an ideal for the American working class for decades. The beginning of the Civil War in 1861 reinforced industry's growth. Inflation rose rapidly and wages did not keep up. Unions expanded in response to the growing dissatisfaction. Republican governors began to use armed forces to suppress strikes, such as at an arms factory in Cold Springs, New York, and intervening to stop war workers from forming a union in St. Louis. 51. After the war's 1865 conclusion, workers organized the first large unions in American history. At a Baltimore convention in 1866, workers founded the National Labor Union, NLU, the first attempt to create a labor federation of unions from around the nation. It was led by William Silvis, an iron molder from Philadelphia who had been involved in unions from an early age. He had a vision for a national organization and in 1859 had created the National Union of Iron Molders, becoming its first president. The NLU had one major goal, the 8-hour day. It got a bill passed in Congress in 1868 mandating it for federal employees. Several states also passed 8-hour laws by 1868, but enforcement lacked at both the federal and state levels. The NLU grew to perhaps 300,000 members by 1869. However, the NLU was also cursed with the core problem of the American working class, racism. While it claimed to represent all workers, it called the freedom of African Americans unpalatable in its foundational document. A colored national labor union formed for black workers and attempted to work with the NLU, but without a great deal of success. Silvis died in 1869 and the NLU fell apart without his leadership. 52. Women continued organizing as well. One of women's hardest jobs was washing clothes, whether at home or in laundries. Workers who cleaned collars washed them in harsh, caustic chemicals and boiling water. Women working in commercial laundries labored 12 to 14-hour days in extraordinarily hot workplaces for $3 a week. Rapid technological advancements came at the price of worker safety. New starching machines were known for causing horrific burns for workers. On February 23, 1864, Kate Mullany, head of the All-Women Collar Laundry Union, CLU, led 300 workers in Troy, New York, out on strike. Mullany entered the labor force in the early 1860s when her father died, and with her mother an invalid, she became the family's primary breadwinner. Like the vast majority of the collar workers, Mullany was a young unmarried woman. 92% of Irish collar workers were single, and another 5% were widows. The CLU wanted higher wages and better working conditions. Within a week, 20 Troy laundries increased workers' pay by more than 20% and agreed to work on safety issues. The strike made the union successful. The CLU lasted for 5 years, which may not seem long to us today, but in an era of embryonic labor organizations, that was a pretty good run. In 1866, the CLU went on strike again, forcing employers to raise wages to $14 a week, over 4 times what workers had made just 2 years earlier. In March 1869, the CLU won another strike, but this convinced operators to destroy the union. That May, workers again walked off the job. But the owners chose a strategy that would prove very effective at forestalling unionization. They organized themselves to collectively resist the union. They pressured smaller operators to hold out against the clue, began to recruit scab laborers, and worked to control press coverage of the strike in Troy. The workers protested the bad press coverage, but while the Troy Times published a letter by the workers, it refused to endorse their actions. Perhaps the most effective action was to lock out union members. The owners offered higher wages, but only if workers abandoned their union. This proved effective in the face of poverty. The strike was lost and the union destroyed. Mullany faded from view after 1870. We know she married at some point and that she died in 1906 in Troy. She remained poor and was buried in an unmarked grave until the 1990s, when women's rights and labor rights advocates fought to create a national historic landmark to remember Mullany and the Clue. 53. The early strikes by American workers most often failed. They were responses to new industrial systems workers had only begun to understand. Yet these stories make us remember how workers have always struggled against oppression. They remind us that despite the media image of workers as men, women's work played an equally central role in American life, even if male workers added to the oppression women faced from their bosses. Unions are the prime way workers have organized to improve their lives, but even outside of unionization campaigns, workers fight for their rights. These early strikes should serve as an inspiration today, showing us that our ancestors, much like us, faced a rapidly changing world by seeking justice for their brothers and sisters. 2. Slaves on strike. The slaves freed themselves. The contemporary uprisings of African Americans against police violence, systemic racism, low wages, and poverty over the past few years have inspired many people to action. Black Lives Matter, the fight for the $15 minimum wage, the struggle against mass incarceration, and many other movements have led the way in a new era of activism in the United States. These are the latest examples of centuries-long resistance by people of color to white domination and exploitation. From the beginning of European colonization of the Americas, European Americans have sought to exploit people of color, especially their labor. These latest protests are part of a continuum of black resistance in the United States that began with the first slaves imported into Virginia in 1619. The biggest labor strike in American history took place during the Civil War, when slaves simply stopped working for their owners at the first opportunity. They did not wait for Abraham Lincoln to free them. Rather, they took their lives in their own hands through withholding their labor from their masters, fleeing to Union lines, and forcing Lincoln and the North to recognize the new reality of their lives. The self-emancipating slaves are true heroes of working-class struggle. Slavery is fundamentally a labor system. Slaves lived unimaginable horrors every day. They also fought back any way they could. Whether through slowing down their work, stealing from their masters, running away, or rebelling, whenever slaves saw an opportunity to improve their lives, they took it. When opposing soldiers arrived in the South, whether British soldiers during the Revolutionary War and War of 1812 or American soldiers during the Civil War, slaves ran to the arriving armies, hoping for freedom. The black scholar and civil rights leader W.E.B. Du Bois identified this phenomenon in his seminal 1935 book Black Reconstruction in America, when he called slave self-emancipation a general strike, which is a moment when workers across employers and industries collectively stop their labor. Du Bois' insight was ignored by generations of historians imbued with white supremacist ideas, but in recent decades, historians have built upon Du Bois to demonstrate the complex ways that slaves sought freedom. 1. When the Civil War began in 1861, African Americans, slave and free, knew what was at stake: the future of slavery. By walking away from the plantations, withholding their labor from masters who increasingly could not control them, the slaves undermined the Southern economy and morale. By fleeing to Union lines and then fighting for the freedom of themselves and their families, they helped Abraham Lincoln and the Northern public understand the true meaning of the war. By demanding labor rights after the war, they challenged white supremacy, including that in the North. Slavery, the foundation of the American economy. When the English settled in Virginia in 1607, they demanded native peoples serve their every whim. In doing so, they reflected the overall European view of indigenous peoples when they colonized the Americas. The Spanish conquest of Hispaniola in 1492, Mexico in 1521, and Peru in 1533 all included the enslavement of indigenous peoples. The English, French, and Spanish who came to the United States also brought race-based slavery with them. 2. Led by Powhatan, the native peoples of Virginia resisted the English, and the colony nearly collapsed when the colonists, too scared of Indian attacks to leave their fort, starved to death and left the survivors eating the human dead. But in 1612, John Rolfe introduced tobacco into the colony, and Virginia had an economic basis to survive and expand. Tobacco is a labor-intensive crop, and no one who could pay their own way to Virginia would toil for someone else. Large-scale plans to enslave Native Americans failed in the face of the diseases that quickly reduced indigenous populations. Additionally, Native peoples had the ability to escape into the nearby forests. Planters first recruited white indentured servants from England, who took the chance to escape poverty at home. In return for a 5 to 7 year contract, indentured servants would eventually receive land. Planters frequently abused these workers, including with whippings and overwork. Many contracts for women included clauses that if a woman became pregnant, time would be added to her indentureship. If a master raped and impregnated his servant, he could keep her under his control. 50,000 English men and women migrated to Virginia for a chance at a new life between 1630 and 1680. But the cruel conditions and better opportunities at home reduced the supply by the 1670s. Virginians turned to Africans as a permanent labor force in the late 18th century. The first African slaves came to Virginia in 1619. They did not, however, pioneer the transatlantic slave trade. The Spanish and Portuguese were already using African slaves in large numbers. But they had been too expensive for early Virginia planters. However, rising supplies of slaves by 1700 lowered prices and made them available to Virginians. Early Africans had ambiguous legal status in Virginia. Some gained freedom and a very few even bought their own slaves. However, Virginia courts began laying the groundwork for permanent slave status. In 1662, after a slave sued for freedom by claiming his father was white, Virginia decided that slave status was confirmed by the mother. This gave masters the right to rape their slaves and keep their own children as property. Forced sexual labor became central to a system that denied slaves basic human rights. The new era of chattel slavery, that is, slaves who could be bought, sold, and traded, had begun. 4. Slavery spread around the North American colonies. The New England Puritans did not have a plantation economy, but those with the money bought a few slaves. New York became a center of slavery. Slaves did the work of rice and indigo growing in South Carolina and Georgia. The French colony of Louisiana grew sugar, the most labor-intensive slave crop of all, and the basis of European fortunes. To acquire these slaves, slave traders, often operating out of northern colonies such as Rhode Island, bought slaves from Africans. Over 12 million Africans were sent to the Americas, the vast majority between 1701 and 1810. Slave merchants stacked thousands of slaves inside of ships for long journeys to the Americas, in what came to be known as the Middle Passage. If weather delayed the ship and supplies were low, the ship captains would throw live slaves into the ocean to drown. Slaves faced lives of endless toil and exploitation, under the complete control of masters who saw them as beasts of burden, as sex slaves, and as breeders for future profit. 5. These slaves did not accept their new lives if they could help it. In 1739, a group of 20 recent arrivals from Africa under the leadership of a man named Jemmy started the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina. Arming themselves by robbing a gunsmith, they had no intention of accepting their status as slave laborers. They hoped to reach the Spanish fort at St. Augustine, Florida, believing that the enemies of the English would grant them freedom. Gathering more followers as they marched, they killed perhaps 25 whites before engaging in a final bloody battle with the South Carolina militia. 20 whites and 44 blacks died that day. Some of the rebellious slaves were executed, others sent to the Caribbean. South Carolina cracked down by banning slaves from reading and limiting the rights of slaves to assemble in groups, raise food, or earn money. The state also allowed slave owners to kill their slaves. 6. The ideas of the 18th century Enlightenment convinced some white Americans that slavery was wrong. If people had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, did that also include slaves? After the American Revolution, northern states moved toward freeing slaves, sometimes immediately but usually after a period of gradual emancipation. Vermont abolished slavery in 1777, before it became a state, while the rest of the New England states, along with Pennsylvania, followed in the 1780s. By 1804, all northern states had either barred slavery or had plans in place to eventually free slaves, although New York still had some slaves in the 1820s. Talk of emancipation even reached southern states. George Washington freed his slaves when he died in 1799, and Thomas Jefferson bemoaned the existence of slavery and hoped for a way to be rid of it, even though he exploited his slaves for both plantation and sexual labor. 7. Slaves also took matters into their own hands. When they could, slaves used the Revolutionary War to free themselves. While some free blacks and slaves fought for the colonists, the British found that offering freedom to slaves in exchange for fighting was an effective tool to punish Southern revolutionaries. Thousands of slaves fled to British lines, as they would during the War of 1812. After both wars, many of those now freed slaves settled in Nova Scotia, the West Indies, Britain, and Africa. They faced hard lives, poverty, and racism, but they were no longer slaves. Fleeing to British lines, refusing to labor any longer for a planter and instead selling their labor to free themselves and then make their own lives, was a prelude to slaves' response to the Civil War. 8. While slavery slowly withered in the North after the Revolution, it exploded in the South thanks to the rapid expansion of cotton production. The rise of the Industrial Revolution fueled by cotton capitalism transformed the South as much as the North, enmeshing slave owners in a global economy based around commodity production, transnational markets, and debt to fund more slaves and land. Slave owners in states such as Maryland and Virginia who had considered freeing their slaves after the Revolution suddenly found themselves buying up land on the western frontier as fast as wars of genocide pushed the Native Americans off it. This had a brutal effect on slaves, as planters split up slave families, sending some west to work in the cotton fields and keeping others on the original plantation. 9. As the cotton economy developed, planters bred new strains that vastly increased the crop. At harvest time, overseers drove slaves to the point of death to pick every possible boll of cotton. Masters balanced this brutality with maximizing the harvest, often with slaves dying of exhaustion in the fields or being beaten into submission. 10 Violence was at the heart of slave labor. Said the escaped slave and abolitionist legend Frederick Douglass, "I have often been awakened at the dawn of day by the most heart-rending shrieks of an aunt of mine, whom he used to tie up to a joist, and whip upon her naked back till she was literally covered with blood. He would whip her to make her scream, and whip her to make her hush, and not until overcome by fatigue, would he cease to swing the blood-clotted cowskin." 11 Such beatings occurred daily on many plantations. Owners could murder slaves at will. Harriet Jacobs, who hid in her grandmother's attic for 7 years after escaping from her master, wrote of a story of a slave locked in a cotton gin until he died. By the time the gin was opened, rats had eaten much of the body. 12. Slaves rarely rose up in violent rebellions, but owners lived in constant fear of it. Stono remained in the memory of the slaveholders. In 1791, slaves in Haiti revolted against their white masters, leading to the nation's independence in 1804. Slave owners feared a similar revolt in the United States. On January 8, 1811, it seemed that their fears might come true when the German Coast Uprising began in Louisiana. Charles Deslons led this rebellion, with men named Kamana and Harry playing major roles. Kamana and another slave named Cook were Asante warriors, imported from Africa around 1806. Deslons was the son of a white planter and a black slave. As they marched toward New Orleans, hundreds of slaves joined them. Armed with hand tools, knives, and a few guns, they came close to New Orleans before being crushed near modern-day Norco, Louisiana. 44 slaves were tried and executed and around 95 died in all. Slave owners cut off the heads of the slaves, placed them on pikes, and lined the roads with them. 13. Slave owners began fearing rebellion everywhere they looked. In 1822, South Carolina cracked down with vicious violence once they uncovered a plot by Denmark Vesey, a freed slave and minister, to lead a slave rebellion. Even more terrifying to slave owners was Nat Turner's rebellion in August 1831. Turner and a trusted group of fellow slaves began a war of extermination against whites. Armed with axes, knives, and blunt instruments, they went house to house in Southampton County, Virginia, killing between 55 and 65 whites. More slaves joined them and their force grew to 40. Although they moved swiftly and silently, the rebellion was suppressed within 48 hours. Turner eluded capture for over 2 months before he was found and executed in November. 56 slaves were executed, while mobs murdered perhaps 100 innocent slaves in an orgy of anti-black terrorism. Harriet Jacobs remembered the fear slaves in North Carolina felt in the aftermath when white mobs entered their cabins and threatened their lives. Virginia and other states passed laws making it illegal for whites to teach blacks how to read, as Turner's apocalyptic visions based on the Bible represented a very real threat. Each of these moments of heroic resistance laid the groundwork for slaves' actions to free themselves during the Civil War. 14. Rebellions dramatically demonstrate the power of collective action. Far more common were everyday acts of resistance. Slaves taught their children to never reveal their true selves to their owners, creating outer masks to contain their inner thoughts from their masters. They held on to African traditions and developed their own forms of religion in defiance of owners attempting to foist an approved form of Christianity upon them. They faked illness or broke farming equipment. Reading was resistance. They fought to keep what they saw as their customary rights. When a new overseer at Bullercock's Virginia plantation tried to end the slaves' traditional 5-day break at the end of 1769, the slaves beat him up and whipped him. This led to a localized rebellion that left 2 whites dead. 15 Domestic slaves dealt with the tyranny of slave-holding women, who might slap them or burn them with an iron. They resisted too, by laughing at their mistresses, slowing down the work, burning food, or otherwise infuriating their owners. These actions might not have led a rebellion, but they helped slaves retain their dignity. 16 Slaves also escaped. Usually these desperate actions consisted of fleeing to a forest or swamp and only lasted a few days before the hungry slaves returned. A few achieved permanent freedom. Slaves who lived on the border with the free states or near waterways had more opportunities. Slaves in Texas could get to Mexico. But if a slave lived on a cotton plantation in Alabama, the opportunities to run to freedom were few. The Underground Railroad helped a lucky few slaves escape, but most did not have that opportunity. Sometimes, slaves killed their owners rather than subject themselves to mistreatment. In 1855, a 19-year-old slave in Missouri named Celia murdered her master rather than allow him to rape her. He had bought her in 1850 when she was 14. He first raped Celia before they returned to his plantation. She eventually had 2 children by him. Celia did everything she could to stop it. She asked his daughters to intervene. She pleaded with him. Nothing helped. One night, she smashed his head with a brick and burned his body. Her crime was discovered the next day and she was executed after delivering her master's stillborn child. 17. This was the peculiar institution. Southern whites committed treason against the United States to defend in 1861. After decades of expansionist policies that included stealing half of Mexico in the Mexican-American War, after demanding increased protection for their human property that included the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and the ability to take their slaves into free territories, the result of the Supreme Court's infamous Dred Scott decision, and after justifying these actions with an intellectual framework that declared slavery a positive good that created the ideal society, Southern nationalists decided to leave the United States. What they did not anticipate is that their own slaves, who they sincerely believed were loyal to them, would destroy their way of life by walking off the plantations. 18. The Slave Strike and the Civil War. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces in South Carolina fired on American troops at Fort Sumter, off the coast of Charleston. The Civil War had begun. 11 Southern states made up the new Confederate States of America, a nation explicitly founded on slavery. Their documents of secession repeatedly stated the need to defend slavery. Abraham Lincoln believed that most Southern whites were Unionists at heart and that a moderate policy could entice them to rejoin the United States. He was wrong. The Republican Party was deeply divided over slavery in 1861. Abolitionists urged immediate emancipation, but conservatives feared the loss of the border states to the Confederacy. Lincoln took a moderate tone and delayed doing anything about slavery except reassuring border states he would not interfere with their human property. 19. Southern whites had convinced themselves that their slaves were happy and content with their lives. The New Orleans Crescent wrote of the absurdity of the assertion of a general stampede of our Negroes. 20 other Southern papers talked of how the loyal slaves would allow the whites to fight the war while keeping masters wealthy. When Confederate President Jefferson Davis left his Mississippi plantation to take office, his wife wrote that he assembled his Negroes and made them an affectionate farewell speech, to which they responded with expressions of devotion. 21. Slaves proved their owners wrong. They started fleeing, showing up at Union lines almost immediately. A few generals quickly realized the military potential of the slaves. Some abolitionist generals used their power to end this national evil. General John C. Fremont, the Republican candidate for president in 1856, declared slaves free in Missouri. General David Hunter, working on the South Carolina coast, freed all the slaves who could make it to his lines and created the first black regiment of troops in U.S. history. Lincoln, fearful of the regiment's impact upon both slave-owning border states that remained in the Union and a northern population largely nervous about ending slavery, reversed both decisions. 22. Slaves taking freedom into their own hands forced the issue. 8 slaves escaped and arrived at U.S. lines at Fort Monroe, at the very spot where the first slaves arrived in Virginia in 1619. The commanding officer, Benjamin Butler, immediately recognized the value of the slaves to his forces. Rather than free them and risk Lincoln's ire, he declared them contraband and, realizing that he could take the Confederacy's labor force, he put the escaped slaves to work in the fort. When slaves heard about this, more showed up. Lincoln appreciated Butler's justification. If the South considered slaves property, then taking property was acceptable by the standards of war. No racial radical, Butler even had his troops keep track of hours the contraband worked so their masters could be paid at the end of the war. Butler's actions outraged Confederates, who had the gall to demand the return of their escaped slaves by invoking the Fugitive Slave Act, even though they had renounced the United States. For slaves, who understood this was a war about slavery even if Northern whites did not, working for the military furthered their freedom, even if Butler did not pay them. By June 1861, over 500 slaves had fled to Fort Monroe. Other commanders began following Butler's lead. Slaves changed the national strategy over the relationship between slavery and the war. 23. What the slaves had done is strike in the form of self-emancipation. When they fled to the Union Army, the now ex-slaves undermined the Confederate war effort. The Confederate elite needed slaves to grow the cotton they hoped to sell to the British for weapons and other war material. When slaves refused, they freed themselves and withheld their labor from their oppressors. Even when they could not run away, with many of their masters away at war, slaves took more control over their lives and slowed or even stopped their work. Without their labor, the Confederate war effort melted. To quote Dubois, it was a general strike that involved directly in the end perhaps 500,000 people. They wanted to stop the economy of the plantation system, and to do that they left the plantations. 24 Whenever the Union troops arrived, slaves just left their plantations, as they had done when British forces gave them the opportunity in the American Revolution and War of 1812. South Carolina slave Robert Smalls used his knowledge of the Charleston waterways to commandeer a ship, pick up the families of himself and his crew, and sail the ship to the North. 25 Meanwhile, as the journalist Charles Carlton Coffin wrote, when the Union Army began shelling the South Carolina Sea Islands, a planter ordered his overseer to round up the slaves to move them inland. But as soon as the slaves heard the shells, they fled into the woods, and the overseer found his drove of human cattle gone. The planter left without his human property. 26 Another planter lost 75 slaves in one night in March 1863. 27 With many men away, slaves who did not have the opportunity to run took more control on the plantations. Virginia slave owners complained constantly about slaves slowing down in the tobacco fields after the war began. 28 The radical secessionist Edmund Ruffin was shocked when 70% of his slaves walked away from his Virginia plantations in 1862. He could not understand how there was not an indication of disobedience or discontent, and then immediately nearly every male over the age of 12 disappeared. For someone such as Ruffin, who had convinced himself that his slaves were happy, the expression of slave self-emancipation was shocking. 291 Slave coachman, freed in 1862, went into his master's bedroom, dressed himself in the master's finest clothes, and walked out the door. 30 Slaves on one plantation 60 miles southwest of New Orleans simply announced that they would take Christmas off and erected wooden gallows to ensure the owner knew they were serious. 31 Escaped slaves proved critical to the American war effort. Many of them went to work for the U.S. military. By cooking, digging latrines, and burying soldiers, they freed up the military to fight the war at the same time that Confederate plantations lost their labor force, leading to declines in cotton and food production. Even when they could not escape, they provided intelligence to Union troops, guiding them through swamps and informing them of the state of Confederate defenses. But they wanted more: the right to pick up a gun against their former masters. Immediately after the war commenced, Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists urged Lincoln to enlist black troops. In May 1861, Douglass wrote an editorial that argued that carrying the war into Africa was the ticket for victory over the Confederacy. 32 But Lincoln did not think blacks would make good soldiers, and he continued to fear the impact on the slave-owning border states that had remained in the United States. Lincoln, a white man of his time, questioned whether whites and blacks could live together peacefully. Well into the war, he toyed with colonization schemes to send slaves back to Africa or to Central America, struggling to imagine a nation with a large free black population. 33 Yet the bravery of the slaves pushed a reluctant Union toward abolition. By mid-1862, with pro-Union forces in control of the border states, Lincoln reconsidered his position on slavery and black troops, signing new laws that moved the nation toward ending slavery. Finally, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln announced the impending Emancipation Proclamation. This groundbreaking announcement freed all slaves in areas of rebellion beginning on January 1, 1863. Slaves could not have ended slavery without the help of the federal government, but without their own actions, it's highly unlikely the Lincoln administration would have issued the proclamation. It did not free any slaves in most, though not all, areas controlled by the United States. But if slavery was eliminated in Mississippi and South Carolina, it could not survive in Delaware and Kentucky. By 1864, slavery in the border states began to wane, and with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, slavery was legally dead, an amazing achievement. 34 The Lincoln administration began to arm black soldiers in 1863. African Americans, both freedmen in the North and slaves who had recently freed themselves, rushed to join the military. Confederates were furious. Robert E. Lee called it a savage and brutal policy. 35 Frederick Douglass traveled across the North to recruit black troops. Around 200,000 African Americans served in the Union military during the Civil War. Around 81% of them originated from slave states, where they fought for their own freedom and that of their families, albeit always under white officers. Some were recruited from the northern free black population, including the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, made famous by the film Glory. Confederates often executed black soldiers they took as prisoners of war, most notoriously at the Fort Pillow Massacre in Tennessee in 1864, when regiments commanded by Confederate general and future Ku Klux Klan founder Nathan Bedford Forrest murdered surrendering black troops in one of the war's worst atrocities. 36. As the war reached its bloody conclusion, slaves became ever braver in demanding their freedom. One slave in Georgia shoved her mistress into a fire and fled to Union lines. A group of slaves near Pineville, South Carolina, started burning plantation homes to the ground. When Union troops arrived at the Cherry Grove plantation in South Carolina in March 1865, the slaves urged them to burn it so their hated mistress could never return. Rice planter Charles Manigault wrote in outrage how his slave, Peggy, confiscated anything she could carry from the man who had stolen her labor for her entire life. Each of these individual actions undermined white morale in the South, with slave owners now worried as much about slave rebellions on the plantations as about declining fortunes in battles against Union armies. 37. When William Tecumseh Sherman marched through Georgia in 1864, destroying the heart of the Confederacy, he knew slaves would follow his forces. They poured toward Sherman's lines. Sherman himself had little interest in black welfare. A racial conservative, he found his status among the slaves as a Moses bemusing. Some of his soldiers committed atrocities against the freed slaves, but wanting to crush the treason of the slaveholding South, Sherman sought to help the slaves, if for no other reason than to get them to stop following his army, which was slowing them down and forcing him to feed the slaves at the same time his own forces were foraging off the land. He met with black leaders on the South Carolina and Georgia coast and asked what they wanted. Their leader, a 67-year-old Baptist minister named Garrison Frazier, replied, "The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land, and turn it and till it by our own labor." 38. So, on January 16, 1865, Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, which granted 40-acre plots of land to African Americans and the use of an army mule in the coastal areas of those states. The idea of 40 acres and a mule became a powerful demand for freed slaves because it meant control over their labor and their independence from whites. 39. Slaves wanted their masters' lands confiscated and redistributed as subsistence plots. In March 1865, now freed slaves took over the Keithfield rice plantation in South Carolina. During the next year, 150 people worked it on their own. When the owner returned in early 1866, she asked her neighbor Francis Parker to help her recapture it. Parker had executed escaped slaves during the war. He hired a former slave driver named Dennis Hazel to be the new overseer. When the ex-slaves saw Parker and Hazel, they erupted in a bloody riot. Led by the plantation's women, they threatened to kill the interlopers. The freed people beat them with their working tools and then attacked a soldier accompanying them. A former slave named Becky hit Parker in the right eye with a club, causing blood to gush across his face. Finally, they dove into the river to escape. Former slaves would fight to the death to control their land and labor. 40. But despite Sherman's plan, the U.S. military had already developed different ideas. On November 7, 1861, the U.S. Army occupied the South Carolina Sea Islands, rich cotton land laced with wealthy plantations that Confederate elites fled from because they could not be defended. Suddenly having to deal with the existence of thousands of slaves with no masters, the military engaged in what became known as the Port Royal Experiment. By January 1862, the government was working with the black population to grow cotton for the army for $1 for every 400 pounds they harvested, and philanthropists had recruited northern teachers to come and work with the free people. The army ended the slave system of gang labor, gave workers garden plots for themselves, and provided a variety of incentives for the workers. The free people hoped to own their own land. But the U.S. Treasury officials running the revived plantations saw potential profit paying black workers low wages. In 1863, Lincoln instituted a plan to sell some abandoned Confederate lands in the Sea Islands. Although most of the ex-slaves could not afford the price of $1.25 per acre, they pooled resources to buy about 2,000 acres of land. Northern whites also bought the land, creating new plantations for themselves worked by paid laborers. Other military leaders instituted similar labor regimes on land their forces occupied, such as General Benjamin Butler's use of paid black field hands to grow sugar. Yet northern whites who leased the plantations routinely stole African Americans' wages, an omen of the struggles the freed slaves would face after the Civil War ended. 41. African Americans achieved their freedom because their actions forced the hands of the Lincoln government and the army. When their demands no longer coincided with the federal government's needs, could free people control their own labor? The triumph of white supremacy. The Confederacy finally surrendered in 1865, in no small part because so much of their labor force had walked away. The 13th Amendment banned slavery. But what did freedom and slavery mean? Most Southern and Northern whites believed black laborers should toil on plantations for white landowners. The North needed cotton for its factories and to sell overseas to pay off war debts. The South wanted to force black laborers to provide that cotton in conditions as near to slavery as they could. The period of Reconstruction, lasting from 1865 to 1877, would determine the fate of the emancipated slaves and the new labor system to replace slavery. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated 5 days after the war ended by a Southern sympathizer from Maryland, the Tennessean Andrew Johnson ascended to the Oval Office. A white supremacist replacing Lincoln is one of the greatest tragedies in American history. Johnson opposed the Confederacy, but he also fervently opposed black rights. This gave the former slaveholders the initiative to re-establish their control over their former laborers. Johnson reversed Sherman's Special Field Order No. 15, the promise of 40 acres and a mule, and the army took back the land distributed to ex-slaves. On the plantations, former owners sought to either force workers back into total subservience, kick them out, or murder them. Ex-slave Henry Adams, remembering the post-war days near Shreveport, Louisiana, reported, "Over 2,000 colored people killed trying to get away, after the white people told us we were free." 42 Calvin Hawley, a black soldier serving in Mississippi, wrote, "Some are being knocked down for saying they're free, while a great many are being worked just as they used to be when slaves, without any compensation." 43. The freed slaves had a very different idea about their life and labor in the post-war world. Thousands left the plantations for cities, including Atlanta, New Orleans, Memphis, and Richmond, where they found jobs and built free communities. By the 1890s, African Americans filled 90% of the unskilled positions in Birmingham's rapidly growing steel industry, but whites forced them into the most dangerous, toxic workplaces with high death rates. 44 That fact sums up much of post-war Southern labor history. On the plantations, ex-slaves resisted white attempts to force women and children to work in the fields, preferring that women avoid that hard labor and children go to school. They sought full autonomy over their labor, under no control from whites. They wanted land on the farms and they demanded good wages in the cities. Associating cotton with the detested slave labor, many fought to grow subsistence crops instead, even if they remained poor. In the countryside, as in the cities, they built schools and churches and fought for the vote. 45. This infuriated the former slave owners. They demanded compliant black labor, and they used violence to ensure it. They instituted the Black Codes, laws recreating slavery in all but name. Building upon the slave codes regulating black behavior before the war, blacks in rural areas had to labor for white under one-year contracts. The Mississippi Code used the category of vagrancy to control black workers. This was a term long used in the United States to crack down on workers, white or black, who did not have a job. In this case, it meant not working for a white person. A vagrant could be thrown into prison or rented out to work for free. Mississippi did not allow blacks to rent land for themselves, and black workers did not have the option to quit working. If a black worker did not work for a white, the state would contract that person out to a private landowner and receive a portion of their wages. If a black person could not pay high taxes levied on them by the state, they received a vagrancy charge and the same process resulted. As during slavery, any white person could legally arrest any black person. It was illegal for whites to assist a black person in an escape from their landowner. That provision also stated that blacks caught running away from their employer would lose their wages for the year. Children whose parents could not take care of them would be bonded to their former owners. Other forms of black behavior were also criminalized, such as preaching without a license or using insulting language toward whites. Interracial marriage, it almost goes without saying, was banned as well. Terrorist organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, founded in 1865, formed to ensure black compliance with white demands. 46. A disgusted Republican Congress quickly declared the Black Codes invalid and instituted the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency dedicated to entangling post-war Southern race and labor relations. Its designers hoped to help free people negotiate contracts with planters and to intervene in cases of violence against black workers. Ex-slaves saw the Freedmen's Bureau as their best hope for the government to enforce their labor rights. At times, it worked well, but it was always underfunded and often staffed by politically appointed agents more sympathetic to slaveholders than African Americans. Some bureau agents barred freed slaves from entering cities, requiring them to sign contracts to work on plantations. Ultimately, it had far too few agents to counter the violence faced by ex-slaves. Employers routinely broke contracts with freedmen if they registered to vote and tried to deny them their contractual compensation at the end of the harvest. It also made many Northern conservatives uncomfortable because it set a precedent of government interference in labor relations. Congress slashed the Bureau's funding in 1869 and killed it in 1872.47. Sufficiency. A group of politicians and abolitionists known as the Radical Republicans wanted to expropriate planter land and distribute it to ex-slaves, but most Republicans disagreed. They valued the former slaveholders' private property over autonomy for black laborers. Northern banks had loaned millions to indebted planters and wanted repayment. Northerners wanted to apply their free labor ideology to the slaves, even though they lacked the capital or education to win equal rights on the job market. Colonel Orlando Brown made this clear to ex-slaves in his 1865 published address to the freedmen of Virginia, in which he told them, "You are to direct and receive the proceeds of your own labor and care for yourselves." Brown also instructed ex-slaves to save their wages and be frugal if they wanted to succeed. 48. The ex-slaves largely ignored these moral lessons and continued to claim their own rights as they defined them. Black women hired as domestic servants, sometimes in the houses where they used to be slaves, quit over everything from low wages and bad working conditions to wanting to spend more time with their own families. Women working in laundries in Jackson, Mississippi, organized in 1866, presenting an open letter to the mayor that stated they would charge a uniform rate to everyone who hired them, taking the power to set wages into their own hands. These sorts of actions angered Southern whites, who even appealed to the Freedmen's Bureau to try to keep black workers under control. 49. In Florida, black workers alternated between working on the railroad, in phosphate mines, and going to labor in Alabama coal mines, often leaving the cotton fields entirely. In response, white employers wanted to find more pliable workers, even considering schemes to import Chinese immigrants to work for next to nothing. By the late 19th century, the Southern police state turned to convict labor to provide its black unpaid labor. In the late 1860s, Virginia convicted a young black man named John Henry of a minor theft and turned him over to a railroad to labor in tunnel building, where he would soon die of disease and become the subject of a legendary set of songs about a heroic black man laboring faster than a machine. 50. Despite all of these barriers to true freedom, former slaves took command over their own lives in ways unthinkable before the war. Black Virginians acquired up to 100,000 acres of land by the early 1870s and perhaps 1 million acres by 1900.51, but only about 100,000 of the 4 million former slaves managed to buy their own land. Many ended up sharecropping. White landowners rented land and supplies such as farm animals, plows, and seed to black workers in return for between 25 and 50% of the crop. Landowners routinely cheated often illiterate sharecroppers out of their crop, forced them into debt, and those who complained were forced off the land, beaten, or lynched. Generation after generation remained in dire poverty. Yet sharecropping was also a compromise that reinforced a limited freedom. White landowners wanted to replicate slavery after the war. That meant keeping black labor under watch from the plantation house. But African Americans refused to live under white eyes and built houses scattered around the old plantation. They would not work under the gang labor system of slavery. They demanded access to their own plot of land. Even if they could not own it, they would rent it and work it on their own. Whites had little choice but to acquiesce to these demands and find new ways to cheat black workers. 52. Sharecropping was not slavery, but it was pretty horrible. Whites, both Northern and Southern, deserve the blame for suppressing black economic equality. For Northerners, ending slavery opened the South for greater economic growth on Northern terms, but black demands remained secondary to economic development. Northerners thought black laborers' place in the new economy was producing cotton for New England textile factories, not food for their own tables. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, many Republicans moved to supporting black rights, but this faded by the early 1870s as economic questions took greater precedent over race in Northern politics. When Southern whites violently retook control over blacks in the 1870s, Northern Republicans, politically weakened by economic troubles, let them do so. Reconstruction ended with a whimper in 1877, as Republicans pulled all troops out of the South in exchange for their presidential candidate Rutherford B. Hayes taking the Oval Office after a contested election. The end of Reconstruction did not mean the end of black workers taking their destiny into their own hands. They continued to press for political and labor rights. They tried forming unions, whether among Richmond dock workers, Alabama farmers, or factory workers anywhere they found a job. They organized in the Colored National Labor Union, a short-lived union of black industrial workers of the early 1870s. But with no interest from Northern whites in protecting black workers, the White South, now controlling politics with violence, crushed black labor movements. The rise of Jim Crow would lock African Americans out of legal rights in the South, and black expressions of power would be met with brutality. In 1887, a group of white vigilantes violently suppressed a strike of black sugar workers in the fields around Thibodaux, Louisiana. The black sugar workers made 60 to 65 cents a day, paid in company scrip instead of cash to keep them dependent on their white employers. But they had never accepted white attempts to recreate dependence, and they had protested every year since 1880. In 1887, the workers issued a list of demands that included a raise to $1.25 a day, biweekly payments, and cash pay instead of the company store scrip. Former slave Junius Bailey sent a letter to the sugar planters that read, "Should this demand be considered exorbitant by the sugar planters? We ask them to submit such information with reason therewith to this board not later than Saturday, October 29th inst. Or appoint a special committee to confer with this board on said date. The sheer existence of such demands and such a letter infuriated the white elite, who still considered slavery the rightful status of black labor. Up to 10,000 workers went on strike. 53. Mary Pugh, owner of the Live Oak Plantation, said that unless this strike was repressed, white people could live in this country no longer. On November 22, the White Peace and Order Committee closed the roads into Thibodaux and decided to deal with the strikers as violently as possible. That morning, the state militia walked into town and started killing black people at random. The militia went house to house, executing them in cold blood. Black workers fled the city and the strike was suppressed. At least 35 were killed. But some have estimated that number could be as high as 300. The editor of the Thibodaux Star, who had been a member of the murderous militia, wrote of Negroes jumping over fences and making for the swamps at double quick time. We'll bet 5 cents that our people never before saw so large a blackberrying as they have seen this week. Mary Pugh wrote, I think this will settle the question of who is to rule, the nigger or the white man. For the next 50 years, but it has been well done and I hope all trouble is ended. 54. The racial dispossession and oppression that drove people into deep poverty during the late 19th century was not limited to African Americans either. Native Americans, driven off their land and conquered by the United States in genocidal wars that culminated on the Great Plains in the 1870s and 1880s, faced continued attacks on their own ways of work. The erasure of wildlife such as the bison forced them into dependence on the United States. With white Americans seeing native peoples as lazy and undeserving of help, they were driven to desperation. Even after the conquering of their land, whites used the Dawes Act of 1887 to dispossess them of their reservation land, granting individual people only 160 acres of land and then selling the rest to white settlers undermined what was left of their traditional economies. They still labored, making baskets for tourists, working as agricultural laborers, or serving the needs of local white residents, but within a racial caste system that doomed them to endemic poverty, and which still plagues the tribes today. 55. Black labor and political organizing challenged white supremacy, and violence was the result. Black workers would not achieve true freedom in the United States after the Civil War, and they never have, still facing poverty, doomed to low-wage jobs and high levels of unemployment, and, in many states, struggling against political restrictions on black voting put in place by a new generation of racist Republican legislators. This is all a legacy of slavery and the racism at its base. And yet, the slaves' general strike transformed the United States, perhaps more than any other labor action in American history. It ended the nation's original sin, slavery. It challenged racism and it showed what workers can do by withholding their labor from their employer. The black struggle for economic, political, and social equality has remained a central part of the larger struggle for worker rights throughout American history, and it must remain so today if economic and racial justice will ever be achieved. 3. The 8-hour day strikes. Industrial capitalism betrayed American workers. The Civil War changed the course of American history. Beyond ending slavery, the single most revolutionary movement in all of American history, it also led to unprecedented growth in the size of the government, the first federal income tax, the creation of land-grant colleges, unprecedented laws to spur national development, including the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act, which led to the Transcontinental Railroad, and the development of military tactics used after the war to defeat Native American tribes in genocidal campaigns. 1. The Civil War also radically transformed the American economy, setting in motion the Gilded Age, the name Mark Twain gave to a society plagued by rampant corruption, enormous income inequality, and monopoly capitalism. Gilded Age profits came on the backs of working Americans, many of whom were Civil War veterans who believed strongly in free labor. They believed capitalism should work for them. They felt their hard work would create a nation of relative equality among independent white men based around economic and political independence from masters of any type. But the new industrial capitalism made a few millionaires the new masters, and white workers compared themselves to slaves because their free labor ideology had proven false. Worker resistance in this period dealt with figuring out how to deal with the betrayal of this free labor ideology. As late as 1900, many believed capitalism was a just system if they could fix what allowed the monopolists to dominate their lives. Workers thought if they could fix one thing, whether eliminating Chinese immigration, creating a cooperative economy, or taxing property, free labor could be salvaged and the nation would get on the right track. The most successful of the responses to industrial capitalism was the struggle for the 8-hour day. To achieve this, workers joined the nation's first big union, the Knights of Labor, culminating in the strikes of 1886. These strikes came to a violent conclusion at Haymarket Square in Chicago, when an anarchist threw a bomb at the police during a march against the police murder of 3 strikers. The state arrested the city's leading anarchists, then convicted them of murder without evidence and executed their leaders. The bombing turned public opinion against the Knights of Labor, and employer opposition to negotiating with the union led to defeated strikes and declining membership. The government's role in crushing radicalism and employer schemes to keep their workplaces union-free meant that successfully organizing the masses of American workers would remain an uphill battle, as it continues to be today. A more limited unionism developed in the wake of Haymarket, one that largely accepted the new economic system and asked far less of employers, creating a legacy of moderate unionism that has dominated American workplace organizing to the present. That unionism both acquiesces to the political limitations of radical change in the United States and has held back the American working class's ability to control its own destiny. The Gilded Age. The roots of the corruption that dominated post-Civil War America went back to years before the war, when powerful people began to realize they could get rich off the changes transforming the nation. During the war, the government worked closely with financiers like Jay Cooke to sell war bonds, associating with men who equated self-interest with patriotism and who after the war would engage in dangerous financial speculation that routinely sabotaged the American economy. The wartime economy launched the careers of men such as John D. Rockefeller, who ran a profitable Cleveland shipping business, invested in refineries for Pennsylvania Oil, and became the richest man the nation had ever seen, controlling more than 90% of the nation's oil supply in the late 19th century. 2. These capitalists made their fortunes on the backs of workers suffering through increasingly brutish and nasty lives. By 1900, New York had 3 million people and Chicago more than 1.5 million, a population that had tripled since 1880 and made that city the Midwest's great metropolis. These cities teemed with immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe crammed into substandard housing, desperate to find a better life for themselves than the poverty and religious persecution they faced at home. They provided a huge mass of cheap labor that capitalists could use in the increasingly large factories, some of which, such as Andrew Carnegie's mill in Homestead, Pennsylvania, employed up to 10,000 people. Workers died by the hundreds in mine accidents, by the dozens in factory fires, and one at a time in meatpacking plants and sawmills. The smoke and fumes of the factories choked workers' lungs and poisoned their bodies. For some women, prostitution paid far more than the factories. This was the world in which swelling numbers of workers found themselves by the 1880s. It was not the America they wanted. 3. Gilded Age capitalists and their allies in the media and in government cared little what workers, immigrant or native-born, thought about the new society. Newspapers and politicians claimed each new strike was the arrival of a dangerous revolutionary movement. Abolitionists turned against organized white labor with a fury when factory workers called themselves slaves, comparing their increasingly desperate lives to those of the recently freed African Americans. Social Darwinist writers took Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and applied it to human relations. Calling corporate behavior the survival of the fittest provided an intellectual justification for exploitation. Many native-born Americans assumed that Jews, Italians, Chinese, Mexicans, and African Americans filled a natural place lower on the economic scale as appropriate to their race. Writers and speakers such as Horatio Alger and Russell Herman Conwell portrayed an America where to work hard was a moral calling that ignored or downplayed the brutality of workers' lives. 4. The Civil War also brought an unprecedented period of corruption to American life. The role of shady financiers and politicians on the take grew rapidly. Much of this centered around the railroads. In 1872, the greatest political scandal in American history to that time shook the administration of Ulysses S. Grant. Major stockholders in the Union Pacific Railroad created a sham company called Credit Mobilier of America, gave it contracts to build the railroad, and then personally profited from those contracts. They used stock in the company to pay off their allied politicians, which included Grant's Vice President Schuyler Colfax and future President James Garfield. It was open fraud, and such theft was the order of the day in both national and state legislatures. Politicians were for the rich to buy. 5. Workers resented this corruption and blamed the railroads for the increased inequality they faced. They had good reason to do so. In building the Northern Pacific Railway, the financier Jay Cooke overextended himself. When Cooke's company declared bankruptcy in 1873, it started a downward spiral that sent the economy into a severe depression. 18,000 businesses went under during the Panic of 1873 and unemployment reached 14%. 6 Workers responded by taking to the streets to demand jobs, especially in New York, where unemployment reached 25%. Tompkins Square Park became the center of organizing, with over 1,000 workers attending rallies there. Peter J. McGuire, later the longtime president of the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners of America, led this movement. He called for a mass demonstration on January 13, urging the city to quit evicting unemployed tenants and instead to provide public aid. Newspaper editors and capitalists exploded in indignation over class-based organizing, calling the demonstration the American version of the Paris Commune, the 1871 socialist uprising in France that briefly ruled Paris before its brutal suppression, the capitalists demanded police repression of the workers. On the day of the demonstration, over 8,000 workers met at Tompkins Square Park. 1,600 police officers attacked them, savagely beating the protesters with clubs while horse-mounted police cleared the streets. Samuel Gompers remembered, mounted police charged the crowd on 8th Street, riding them down and attacking men, women, and children without discrimination. It was an orgy of brutality. I was caught in the crowd on the street and barely saved my head from being cracked by jumping down a cellarway. 7. The police arrested 46 workers, mostly unemployed immigrants who could not afford bail, and the movement died under the weight of oppression. 8. Violent suppression of workers became employers' preferred response to organizing. When workers such as the Molly Maguires, an Irish secret society that migrated with immigrants to Pennsylvania, committed violence themselves, state violence was even starker. After the Civil War, membership in the Mollies increased in response to the terrible labor conditions they faced in the mines of northeastern Pennsylvania. A union formed in the area called the Workingmen's Benevolent Association, WBA. Probably 85% of the workforce joined the union by the mid-1870s. The WBA had some initial success, and wages increased. Franklin Gowan, president of the Reading Railroad, responded by hiring Allen Pinkerton to crack down on the union and the Mollies. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was one of several private strikebreaking and security firms that served employers in the Gilded Age. 9 To this day, the term Pinkerton is synonymous with violent strikebreaking. In December 1874, Gowan announced a 20% pay cut, knowing the union would strike. He fed newspapers, invented stories about Molly violence, and Pinkertons killed several strikers and their families. The strike and the WBA collapsed after 6 months, with arrests of the strike leaders. But the Mollies took the fight underground and killed 2 police officers they particularly hated. In addition, a mine boss, bartender, and justice of the peace all died, possibly killed by Mollies, although the facts of these cases are unclear. The police conducted mass arrests. Gowan named himself special prosecutor for the trial, a complete farce of justice. 20 men were given death sentences. 10 were executed on Black Thursday, June 21, 1877. An additional 10 were executed over the next year. The Molly Maguires became synonymous with violent unionism and were used to gin up anti-unionism for decades. 10. The sudden worker uprising of 1877 was more widespread and caused more hysteria among the nation's elites. It began in Martinsburg, West Virginia, when the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad forced its workers to accept their second pay cut in a year. Workers walked out, stating that they would have to steal or starve. 11 rail workers had a lot of power, because if they refused to allow trains to move, they could shut down the nation's transportation network and thus halt business. The strike spread quickly across the nation. Within days, 100,000 workers were on strike from Iowa to New York to Texas, many unemployed working on the picket line in support. In most places, rail workers were outnumbered by citizen protesters who were angry at how railroads ran them down when crossing through cities, polluted their neighborhoods, corrupted their politics, controlled the prices of goods, and made their homes filthy, sooty, and noisy. The Great Railroad Strike lasted 6 weeks. It was the first mass action of industrial workers in American history. Workers completely unrelated to the railroad were inspired to take action on their own, such as the New York cigar makers who walked out and won wage increases. 12 Newspapers called the strikers communists and warned of revolution. Thomas Alexander Scott, president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, said that strikers should receive a rifle diet for a few days and see how they like that kind of bread. 13 He got his wish in Pittsburgh on July 21, when militiamen fired on strikers, killing 20. In response, workers burned 39 buildings and more than 1,400 railcars. The next day, the militia struck again, killing another 20 workers. In Reading, Pennsylvania, state troopers killed 12 people. In Chicago, approximately 20 died after the mayor called for a volunteer militia to crush the strike. In Baltimore, the railroad and state authorities filled the city's streets with hundreds of soldiers. When protesters started throwing stones, the soldiers opened fire and nearly a dozen people died, all everyday citizens who came out to protest the impact of the railroads on their lives. Over 100 people died from the railroads suppressing the protests. The federal government also decisively stepped in on the side of the railroads, setting a strong precedent for the law to tip the balance of power away from workers and toward companies, a theme that runs through most, but not all, of American history. Judge Thomas Drummond of the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit ordered federal marshals to protect the railroads, writing, a strike or other unlawful interference with the trains will be a violation of the United States law, and the court will be bound to take notice of it and enforce the penalty. 14 Finally, President Rutherford B. Hayes called on the U.S. military to end the strike, setting another precedent. that the federal government would openly side with corporations over workers, no matter how legitimate their grievances. This was the first time the U.S. government had directly backed management's position with troops. In the aftermath, hundreds of workers were fired for union activities and blacklisted from the railroads. 15. The strikers of 1877 did not want a revolution. They wanted a return to a free labor society that respected the nobility of toil, a nation of smallholders and entrepreneurs. Many of these workers were Civil War veterans. They saw low wages, brutal working conditions, and employer violence and compared themselves to the slaves the Union had recently freed. The state and employers had placed chains around these white men who believed they were the legitimate heirs of the American Revolution. The comparison between wage labor and slavery went back to the radical writer Thomas Skidmore, whose 1829 pamphlet The Rights of Man to Property called for the confiscation of all property and its redistribution to the people. Skidmore died in 1832, but after the Civil War, growing numbers of workers came around to believing that something was wrong with capitalism. They believed it was fundamentally a good system, but something had gone wrong and a few men had too much money and power. 16. Finding a solution to this spawned a wide array of ideas. Joseph Ray Buchanan, Denver's most prominent labor activist, would later write that in the early 1880s he had been reading everything dealing with social conditions that I could get hold of. I had devoured the writings of the leading political economists and had formed opinions of a just and equitable social and industrial system. 17. Buchanan and other activists and publishers would disperse these ideas to thousands of readers, creating a national debate about how to fix the problems of workers. One of the most prominent solutions came from Henry George's 1879 book Progress and Poverty, in which he argued for a single tax upon property as the surest way to bring corporations under control. He believed people earned the value of their own labor, but land was a common resource for all and thus large landowners should have to pay very high taxes to reduce the era's inequality. George ran for mayor of New York City on a single tax platform in 1886. He came in second in a three-man race. The Republican candidate, Theodore Roosevelt, came in third. The simplicity of George's idea appealed to Americans who still believed that they could avoid class conflict. Others followed the ideas of Edward Bellamy, who in 1888 published Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887, a novel detailing how a visitor from 1887 wakes up in 2000 and finds all the problems of the Gilded Age solved through a peaceful revolution that replaced competitive capitalism with a cooperative society. Reading and discussion groups known as Bellamy Societies popped up around the country to implement his ideas. By 1891, the book had sold nearly 500,000 copies, making it the biggest bestseller of its era. Other Americans, especially in rural areas, thought the ticket to fixing the corruption and greed of America was to get rid of the gold standard and instead issue paper currency based on credit. Greenbackers, as they were called, hoped that expanding the currency away from gold-backed money would increase inflation and give workers and farmers the ability to pay off their debts, taking power away from the corporations that controlled the economy. 18. These responses were productive. Far less so was the white working class demonizing non-white workers and constructing a white identity that excluded other workers, whether black, Irish, or Chinese. 19. These workers believed that immigrants and people of color undermined white workers' wages and that eliminating the competition would reset the system to work for them. Racial divisions have long plagued working class solidarity in the United States and continue to do so today. By the 1870s, this led to both racial violence and the opportunity for employers to break unions by importing groups of workers that strikers hated. 20. When white Americans arrived in California to mine gold in 1849, they found Chinese and Mexican miners already there. Whites seized the mines. The Chinese then filled service jobs for whites in laundries and restaurants and worked brutal jobs building the railroads under near-slave conditions. San Francisco workers responded to the 1877 railroad strikes by forming mobs not against railroad companies but against Chinese workers. 21. The Workingmen's Party of California adopted the banning of Chinese immigration as its sole issue. Congress responded by passing the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the first law barring immigration to the United States based on national origin. A law enshrining racism was the American labor movement's first major legislative victory. Violence continued against Chinese workers through the rest of the century, most notoriously in Rock Springs, Wyoming, in 1885. When a rampaging mob of whites committed an act of ethnic cleansing by murdering at least 28 Chinese miners. 22. In later years, whites in the American West would continue lobbying to eliminate unwanted foreign labor, such as by pressuring the federal government to stop Japanese immigration. They succeeded in 1907, undermining the cross-racial organizing of such organizations as the Japanese-Mexican Labor Association, a pioneering farmworker organization that California's white-dominated labor movement rejected because it refused to accept Asian Americans. 23. Whether through getting rid of the Chinese or embracing Edward Bellamy's ideas or implementing the single tax, most working Americans in the 1880s still fundamentally believed the capitalist system could be tweaked and fixed. However, a few native-born Americans, and a lot more German immigrants, began rejecting capitalism entirely and developing ideas around socialism and anarchism to replace a system that so exploited workers. The writings of Karl Marx were the most important influence, but he was far from the only important theorist. Anarchist thinkers such as Johann Most and Mikhail Bakunin also gained large followings. Many German socialists fled to the United States to escape political repression after 1870. Jewish radicals from Russia would do the same a decade later. Native-born socialists such as Peter J. Maguire traveled the nation speaking about a cooperative society in which workers received the benefits from their own labor. These new socialists would split into innumerable factions, argue about the use of violence versus non-violence, denounce each other for believing in the political system or refusing to support socialist political candidates, and debate obscure theoretical points. They never united into one cause, but they would influence generations of activists and also reshape the course of the strikes to come. 24. The 1886 strike wave. The one issue that united most reformers of capitalism was the 8-hour day. The National Labor Union's brief rise in the 1860s had placed the 8-hour day on the national agenda. In the 1880s, workers built an organization to promote this desperately desired shorter workday. Founded in 1869 by 4 Philadelphia garment cutters as a secret society to remake the labor movement, the Knights of Labor began its rise to prominence in 1879, when Terence Powderly, the mayor of Scranton, Pennsylvania, became its leader. 25 He turned the Knights into an organization that fought for the economic rights of the white working man. Powderly was a superb organizer, and he began uniting the nation's workers around the 8-hour day. Like other reform organizations, the Knights believed in a natural balance of power between employer and employee, but recognized that the massive aggregation of capital into the hands of the few had thrown this out of whack. Workers had become wage slaves to corporate masters. The Knights used the language of war but the strategy of peace. The Knights' manifesto claimed an inevitable and irresistible conflict between the wage system of labor and the Republican system of government. 26 Yet at the same time, Powderly and other leading Knights believed that peaceful arbitration, not striking, was the best method for solving labor disputes. Seeing the organization as representing the interests of most Americans, the Knights invited all producers into their fold, which meant everyone except bankers, speculators, lawyers, liquor dealers, and gamblers. That is, groups it considered leeching off productive workers. It believed that through reform, it could recreate the democratic smallholder republic of pre-Civil War America. 27. For a period when whites were establishing legal segregation and mobs frequently tortured and killed African Americans, the Knights had a remarkably inclusive attitude toward black workers, attempting to build alliances for mutual benefit, even in the South. In Richmond, Virginia, African American workers flocked to the Knights by 1884, with black workers organizing several assemblies. The Knights, careful to walk America's race line so as not to alienate white workers, created segregated assemblies that allowed for labor solidarity without racial mixing. Black workers used the Knights to build racial pride and to fight the growing system of segregation, and blacks and whites worked together in ways almost unheard of during this deeply racist period, for instance both gaining wage increases through simultaneous quarry worker strikes in Richmond. 28. Its Alabama chapter urged white workers to set aside all prejudices against the colored laborer, and in some southern areas, up to half of Knights membership was African American. 29 Sometimes, white and black workers struck together, such as in a January 1887 strike in Pensacola, Florida, in which black and white longshoremen walked to support a strike of black fertilizer workers. 30 Like most working men, the Knights opposed women working outside the home. Their idealized society had women in the home, no longer needing to toil for wages, which also delegitimized all the women in the workforce as having a voice in union politics. By 1887, about 10% of Knights members were women and about 10% were African American. 31. Still, the Knights' coalitions with black workers were tenuous, strained, and often temporary. Moreover, Knights wanted the Chinese expelled from the nation, and they also strongly doubted Polish, Hungarian, and Italian immigrants' ability to be good Americans. They believed black workers had the capacity for Republican self-government because of their long period in the United States and thus could be allies, if not racial equals. But these immigrants could not be part of the Knights' idealized America because they lacked the capacity for republicanism. 32. The fight for the 8-hour day was a fight for workers to take control of their own lives. The Knights adopted the great line from I.G. Blanchard and Reverend Jesse H. Jones's popular song, 8 hours, as its own. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, 8 hours for what we will. 33 workers routinely labored 10, 12, 14 hours in the Gilded Age. Steelworkers had to work a 24-hour shift twice a month in an extraordinarily deadly workplace with no safety protections. In 1867, the Illinois legislature passed an 8-hour law, but business ignored it. Workers struck and lost. The federal government passed a limited 8th day law for a few workers in 1868. Again, it lacked enforcement. In 1872, nearly 100,000 workers in New York City struck for nearly 2 months to demand that the state enforce its recently passed 8-hour law. 34 An 1880 survey of New England textile and paper mill workers demonstrated that most workers wanted to use their leisure time, often quite a bit less than 8 hours, to just live, visit family, take a walk, go outside, do whatever they wanted. 35 8-hour leagues sprung up across the nation, and workers joined the Knights of Labor and other labor organizations in the 1880s to fight for the 8-hour day. Powderly's leadership created a mechanism for workers to find the Knights appealing, but being open to nearly everyone meant that people joined who did not understand the Knights. The open nature of the Union laid the groundwork for its demise. The organization was extremely loose, and Powderly had no real control over what individual lodges did. Powderly and the Knights' leadership believed that peaceful action could transform the nation back to its rightful small producer orientation. They ran candidates for office and wanted labor conflicts settled with arbitration, hoping to avoid strikes. 36 Even these moderate positions alarmed the nation's elites. The New York Sun opined that the Knights could array labor against capital, putting labor on the offensive or the defensive, for quiet and stubborn self-protection, or for angry, organized assault, as they will. 37. The Great Strike year of 1886 began on the western railroads of the rapacious investment capitalist and railroad magnate Jay Gould. Gould had already earned a reputation as an enemy of everyday people, and he was portrayed in the popular media as a near monster who destroyed honest men on Wall Street. His control over the railroads made him a popular target. In 1885, railroad workers on the Missouri Pacific struck after he cut their wages. Powderly helped sell the strike, and workers won a settlement that included rehiring strikers and paying back wages. This victory gave the Knights legitimacy as an effective union, and hundreds of thousands of workers joined over the next few months. In the next year, membership grew from 110,000 to 700,000 members, or so the Knights claimed. Overnight, the Knights became the first mass organization in American workers' history. The strike worked, but Powderly's discomfort with direct action remained. 38. Gould had the money to play the long game against the Knights. In Marshall, Texas, a Knights member working for a Gould Railroad was fired for attending a union meeting on work time. His fellow workers walked off the job to demand his rehiring, as well as more pay. The strike spread among workers infuriated with Gould over the terrible wages, long hours, and dangerous working conditions they endured. Starting in Texas and moving into Arkansas, Kansas, Missouri, and Illinois, upwards of 200,000 workers walked off the job, making the Great Southwest Railroad strike the largest of the nation's 1,400 strikes in 1886.39. The strike showed the great militancy of workers in 1886 but also exposed the Knights' problems. First, other rail unions, such as the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, refused to recognize the strike and continued to work. Battles between unions often hurt strikers as much as battles with employers or the state. Solidarity between different sections of the working class is a great goal but incredibly hard to achieve, then and now. Second, Terence Powderly still resisted mass strikes. He wanted to quickly settle it with Gould. But the plutocrat refused, sensing his opportunity to sweep organized labor from his railroads. Perhaps apocryphally, he said about the strikers, "I can hire one half of the working class to kill the other half." 40 Like the rail barons in 1877, Gould could rely on corporate-friendly politicians to crush the strike. The governor of Missouri called out the state militia, and the governor of Texas mobilized the Texas Rangers. U.S. Marshals assisted these forces. Gould also hired the Pinkertons. At least 9 workers died in shootouts between workers and trains running through the strikers. Gould's violence forced workers back on the job. The media helped, painting the strike as the ultimate battle between capital and labor, raising the stakes for an already nervous public. The strike died at the beginning of May. At the moment the membership of the Knights crested. 41. The Knights' growth and the 8-hour days appeal brought a huge diversity of workers into the organization. Some did not believe in the Knights' principles at all. Some were anarchists, who rejected the power of the state entirely and argued for the use of violence in fomenting revolution. Among them was Albert Parsons. Born in Alabama, Parsons grew up in Frontier, Texas in the 1850s. Although he volunteered for the Confederacy, Parsons later repudiated his past and supported black rights. He married a former slave named Lucy Gonzalez. As Lucy Parsons, she would have a long radical career on her own that extended into the 1930s, and they left Texas for Chicago to protect themselves from intolerance to their political beliefs and their interracial marriage. Parsons first became a socialist newspaper editor and later immersed himself in anarchism, beginning an anarchist newspaper in support of the 8-hour day in 1884.42. By this time, many anarchists argued for the propaganda of the deed. Johann Most promulgated this idea in his visits to Chicago, arguing that anarchist violence against class war enemies would convince workers to revolt, even if innocents died in the process. In 1885, Most published a pamphlet titled Revolutionary War Science, which was a manual on how to make explosives and use them to promote revolution. 43. Parsons played a key role making Chicago the center of the 8-hour movement, giving radical talks around the city. The Knights, uncomfortable with this radicalism and the potential for violence that the anarchists embraced, kept their distance from the growing protests in that city. Terence Powderly began to speak against anarchists within the Knights and urged members to stay away from the planned May 1, 1886 protests. But on that date, between 300,000 and 500,000 workers walked off the job around the nation to fight for the 8-hour day. At least 30,000 of those workers were in Chicago, where strikes had increased from an average of 35 per year between 1881 and 1885 to 307 in 1886.44. Prominent Chicago anarchists such as Parsons and August Spies worked within the Knights because they wanted to be connected to a real workers' movement. They also set much of the local agenda, including demanding their hours be reduced from 10 to 8 with no reduction in pay. 45. This was a tenuous time for the Knights. Just as the Chicago protests peaked, word came that Gould had won the railroad strike, a major blow to labor's morale. One major Chicago factory did not close during the 8th hour strikes. The McCormick Reaper Works, one of the city's largest employers, continued to run, with police-guarded strikebreakers. Its workers had fought for justice for a year after its head, Cyrus McCormick Jr., instituted a 10% wage cut at the same time the company earned record profits. He fired angry workers and brought the Pinkertons in to protect non-union iron molders. This infuriated the largely Irish workforce, who assaulted a trolley of Pinkertons. The rest of the business community convinced McCormick to reinstate the wages to forestall a larger strike throughout the city. The war continued inside the factory, with McCormick firing union activists, but unionists were able to organize most of the workforce into the Knights of Labor by February 1886. Tensions continued to heighten as May approached. The police responded with what had become predictable violence. As August Spies gave a speech in front of the McCormick plant on May 3, some of the strikers began to confront strikebreakers as the workday ended. The police responded by brutally attacking the strikers with both clubs and guns. As the workers ran away, the police shot them. As many as 6 workers died that day. 46. Responding to the murders, Spies and the other anarchist leaders called a march to protest police violence the next day at Haymarket Square. About 1,500 people attended, not a particularly large rally compared to many 8-hour strikes. The language was angry, but the rally was initially peaceful. Albert Parsons gave an hour-long speech, and by the time he finished, only around 500 people remained. As Samuel Fielden closed the rally with one last speech, the police marched into the square to end it by force. At that moment, someone threw a bomb into a crowd of police officers. The police responded by firing into the marchers, killing a disputed number, probably between 4 and 8, and causing most of their own 7 casualties. About 50 people were wounded. 47. The media reacted with anti-radical hysteria. The Chicago Tribune called to bar any foreign savages who might come to America with their dynamite bombs and anarchic purposes. 48 unsure who actually threw the bomb, but assuming it was a conspiracy, authorities tried 8 of Chicago's leading anarchists for the murders. That included Albert Parsons and August Spies, both of whom definitely did not throw the bomb. Parsons was actually in a nearby bar drinking a beer after his speech. Louis Ling openly admitted making bombs but said he would have admitted it had he thrown it. 49. Parsons argued that someone working for the corporations threw the bomb to provide an excuse for police violence and repression. 50. The most likely candidate was anarchist named Rudolf Schnaubelt, who fled the nation immediately after the killings and perhaps lived the rest of his life in Argentina. Yet no one knew for sure. Despite the lack of evidence, 7 of the defendants were sentenced to death and another, Oscar Neebe, was sentenced to 15 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. 2 of the defendants, Samuel Fielden and Michael Schwab, would later have their sentences commuted to life in prison. Ling committed suicide the day before his execution, while Parsons, Spies, Adolf Fischer, and George Engel were hanged on November 11, 1887. The hangings did not break their necks and they were left to strangle to death over the next several minutes. 51. When Illinois Governor John Altgeld, elected as a reformer, freed the 3 remaining prisoners in 1893, the backlash from conservatives destroyed his political career. Haymarket did not immediately end the 8-hour movement in Chicago, but by May 15, the strikes had ended and workers returned to their jobs without a victory. Haymarket and the failed 8-hour strikes brought the ascendancy of the Knights of Labor to a screeching halt. Powderly immediately denounced the anarchists. Some workers were horrified by the violence, others disgusted that Powderly did not denounce the trial of the radicals. At the same time, employers began conspiring to resist the Knights everywhere they operated. This was not a new phenomenon. As early as the Civil War, employers had begun to form trade groups to ensure that workers would not unionize, blacklisting strikers and forcing workers to sign yellow dog contracts that forbade union membership. 52. In 1887, Newark, New Jersey, leathermakers destroyed the Knights' membership in their factories through locking out workers until they left the union. As the Knights did not charge high union dues, it had no money to give to the workers, leaving them impoverished and desperate. In the face of overwhelming employer opposition, this once strong center of Knights membership collapsed within 3 weeks of the lockout. As the leather employers demonstrated, American employers organized a much more effective, coordinated, and well-funded anti-union strategy than employers in Britain or France, and thus unions succeeded more in those nations. 53. This helped set the precedent of the United States as a nation where employers would never accept unions and made unionization extremely difficult for workers to accomplish, a situation that still affects American workers today. Knights membership in Chicago rapidly fell from 400,000 to 17,000 after Haymarket. Nationwide, an organization that had 750,000 members in 1896 plummeted to 80,000 by 1893.54, but workers continued to seek any organization that would help them lead dignified lives and fight the inequalities of the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age's war on workers. The same year that the Knights began its decline, a more conservative union federation began. The American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, an immigrant cigar maker, offered a very different model of unionism. It concentrated on what Gompers called pure and simple unionism, focusing on skilled white male workers who organized to promote better wages, shorter hours, and more control over working conditions, without trying to transform society or get involved in politics. Negotiating a union contract was the goal, not challenging capitalism. Gompers eschewed federal involvement in labor issues, such as laws to protect workers, because the courts could overturn the laws or the government would not enforce them. Only a union contract would ensure worker power. The AFL was a collection of independent craft unions, mostly of skilled Anglo-Saxon workers whose control over their work and their status as elite laborers were slipping in the face of the industrial factory, the growing diversity of the American workforce, and employers seeking to take control over production processes. These unions still believed in the archetype of the independent, free white male laborer, the world of pre-Civil War America. By 1897, Gompers had 264,000 of those skilled workers in his federation. These workers battled owners over control of their work, mechanization, speeding up the work process, and employer prerogative in controlling the shop floor. These were privileged workers, proud of the hard, dangerous jobs they accomplished. Their culture represented that pride. 55. The AFL refused to organize and often demonized any worker who was not a white male, either native-born or from Western Europe. Millions of immigrants poured into the United States from Eastern and Southern Europe after 1880, filling industrial jobs. The AFL had no interest in organizing. It despised radicalism in all its forms and yet sought to crush any rival that would organize the industrial workers. There was little place in the AFL for African Americans and none for Asians. In 1897, the AFL endorsed a literacy test for immigrants to stem the tide of people entering the nation, and in 1898, the AFL convention passed a resolution opposing women holding wage-earning jobs rather than organize the growing number of women in the workforce. 56. While solutions such as Bellamyism, the single tax, and Chinese exclusion would fade from importance, the AFL's vision of reinforcing the skilled white male worker would limit industrial organizing for a half-century. Yet for most employers, even the conservative unionism of the AFL was too much to accept. They desired to break the culture of the working class and they craved union-free factories. They wanted to take away skilled workers' control over their jobs and subject them to greater discipline. They did so through the combination of technological advances and brutality. New technologies in the steel mills, specifically the Bessemer process that allowed for the mass production of steel at low cost with little labor, eliminated the need for puddlers, and so the highest paid and most militant skilled workers could be fired or demoted. A group of puddlers had won perhaps the nation's first union contract in 1865. Deskilling the work gave control of labor back to the employers. Workers fought to keep their jobs. Occasionally they won. In 1889, workers at Andrew Carnegie's homestead steel works organized by the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel. Workers, struck and won a union contract with wage gains for the next 3 years. This was the latest in a long history of battles between Carnegie and unions that dated back to a strike in 1867 when he tried to reduce puddlers' wages. Over and over, Carnegie and his fellow steel employers sought to throw workers out of a job when they fought for the dignity a union can bring. In 1874, Carnegie forced local store owners to not advance strikers' credit so they would be starved back to work. 57. When the contract ended in June 1892, Carnegie decided to destroy the He traveled to his native Scotland and gave his right-hand man, Henry Clay Frick, carte blanche to deal with the union in any way he liked. Frick despised unions. He once personally evicted a striker from company housing by throwing him in a creek. 58 Workers asked for a wage increase. Frick responded with an offer of a 22% pay decrease while making military preparations around the factory to provoke the workers. They hanged Frick in effigy. He locked out workers on June 28. The workers united to keep out scabs. Craft union members controlled the Homestead city government, so Frick could not rely on local police forces. He called in the Pinkertons. When they arrived on July 6, an armed force of workers ready to fight for their jobs met them. For 13 hours, the two sides traded gunfire. Eventually, the Pinkertons surrendered. But Pennsylvania Governor Robert Pattison sent in the National Guard to break the strike. Frick had strikers evicted from company homes and arrested repeatedly so they would have to put up bail they could not afford. 59. Again, anarchists decided to act on their own without consulting the workers. On July 23, Alexander Berkman, an anarchist in a political and romantic relationship with the legendary anarchist activist Emma Goldman, walked into Frick's office, fired 2 shots, and stabbed Frick 3 times. Although armed with a gun and knife, Berkman failed to seriously wound Frick, who was back at work within a few days. In taking it upon himself to revenge the Pinkerton invasion, Berkman undermined public support for the strike and earned himself a 22-year prison sentence. The taint of radicalism helped doom the strike by November. The company welcomed workers back without their union, while blacklisting union leaders. Well known for his vanity and concern about his public image, Andrew Carnegie later regretted his actions at Homestead, writing, "It is expecting too much to expect poor men to stand by and see their work taken by others. The works are not worth 1 drop of human blood. I wish they had sunk." 60. Carnegie's actions were more typical of the Gilded Age than his later regrets. The continued corporate domination of the economy and politics led to repeated bubbles of speculation that burst and threw workers into poverty. Caused by another round of irresponsible railroad speculation, the Panic of 1893 led to the worst economic crisis in American history prior to the Great Depression. Over the ensuing 5 years, unemployment reached as high as 18%, and banks failed across the country. President Grover Cleveland's administration did nothing to alleviate the deepening poverty. The post-Civil War economy had its ups and downs, but the Panic of 1893 convinced many Americans that capitalism and the government would never allow workers to live dignified lives. 61. With employers continuing to respond to workers' reasonable demands with repression, the appeal of violence grew, and not just from anarchists. In 1892, silver miners in Idaho struck when employers demanded they work longer hours for no additional pay. The mine operators hired the Pinkertons to infiltrate the strike. Outraged when they realized Pinkertons had infiltrated their meetings, the miners turned to violence. Miners tried to halt a trainload of scabs from entering the mines. Union men climbed above the Frisco mill, where Pinkertons had opened fire, and dropped a box of powder down a flume. It exploded upon impact, killing 1 mine employee. The Pinkertons ran out and hid in another building. The miners fired into the building, killing another and forcing the Pinkertons to surrender. This led Idaho Governor N.B. Willey to declare martial law and send in the Idaho National Guard to break the Union. Martial law continued for 4 months. Yet another strike of desperate workers was brutally defeated. 62. While the working class struck for their rights when possible, for millions of Americans during the Gilded Age, life was dreary toil. That was especially true for women, who had few options to make a living. Many women labored as sex workers. Sex work had long provided women economic opportunities in American cities. Women who had suffered sexual abuse or rape, or became pregnant and were abandoned by their families, often had few options for survival. Brothels proliferated in the cities, and red light districts were established where sex work would remain quasi-legal. African American women, with even fewer economic options, often worked in the sex trade. In 1890, black women made up only 1% of Chicago's population but 15% of the city's sex workers. The work was exploitative, dull, unhealthy, and often dangerous. But how was that different from working in a Gilded Age factory? 63. The sudden growth of labor violence combined with the deep poverty of the working class and rise in sex work disturbed many middle-class Americans. Employers had a simple answer: violence and coercion. Cities built armories to put down the domestic insurrections they feared from striking workers. But a growing number of people realized that the laissez-faire attitude of the Gilded Age had created such extremes of poverty and wealth that perhaps the government needed to intervene before a revolution upended the nation. The 1901 assassination of President William McKinley by the anarchist Leon Czolgosz only made people feel this more strongly. 64. The middle class increasingly believed that something needed to be done in order to save the United States from the turmoil caused by its industrialization. Before 1900, the government routinely sided with employers, serving as the strikebreaker of last resort. Workers could not overcome this hostility. After 1900, the role of government in deciding the fate of workers' struggles would become even more clear. 4. The Anthracite Strike and the Progressive State. Each major strike forces the state to decide whether it represents workers or employers. The Gilded Age was a very bad time for American workers. Capitalists' unquenchable thirst for profit and their power to control the state meant striking workers faced almost unbeatable odds. The desperation and violence that boiled over during the Great Railroad Strike and at Haymarket continued as workers had no redress for their demands for dignity. The government routinely sided with employers, through legislation that backed capitalists, through court decisions that impeded unions, or through police forces that busted strikes. However, in the early 20th century, a growing concern with inequality and disorder led a new generation of middle and upper-class political and social reformers known as progressives. Combining a complex and overlapping series of reform movements, progressives broadly agreed that a stable nation required workers to have something more than despondency in their future. Both the violent deaths of workers at the hands of employers and the violent responses by increasingly desperate workers framed this change. Progressive-controlled governments could alleviate some of the most extreme exploitation of American capitalism in response to worker activism. The turning point in the state's response was the 1902 anthracite coal strike in Pennsylvania, when President Theodore Roosevelt shocked corporate America by using the federal government to mediate a strike. This new attitude was critically important, for strikers could almost never win without state neutrality. However, this strike, as well as strikes before and after 1902, also demonstrates the stark limitations of progressive interventions into the workplace. The strikes of the 1890s through the 1910s reveal the absolutely critical role government played in American labor history, how the middle class could unite with workers to create positive change, and how working-class outrage and violence could provoke state responses that combined both repression and reform. However, progressives largely did not believe in promoting the power of unions and thus did not change the fundamental balance of power between workers and employers. Pullman and Cripple Creek. Two stories about the state. In the years after the 8-hour strikes of 1886, there was little reason to think that government would change its fundamental anti-labor position. The courts continued backing employers at every step. Even when the government passed the rare bill to limit the power of corporations, right-wing courts interpreted it to stop unions from succeeding while ignoring anti-corporate provisions. Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 to limit the growing monopolies that, as portrayed in popular political cartoons of the time, squeezed the nation like an octopus. Courts rarely enforced it against corporations. But in 1908, the Supreme Court used the law to bust unions in Lowe v. Lawler, deciding that the United Hatters of North America, attempting to organize a hatmaker's shop in Connecticut, had violated the Sherman Act by calling for a nationwide boycott of the company's products, unlawfully restraining trade. If courts interpreted laws that had nothing to do with workers to defang unions, what hope did workers have to organize? 1. Employers expected workers to sacrifice when profits lagged. George Pullman owned the Pullman Palace Car Company, which made sleeper cars for the railroads. He created his own company town south of Chicago, where he lorded over his workers. William Carwardine, pastor of the Pullman First Methodist Church, wrote of the total company domination. It is a civilized relic of European serfdom. Of Pullman, he wrote, "He is the king, and he demands to the full measure of his capacity all that belongs to the insignia of royalty." 2. Pullman charged workers high rents for his company housing, would not employ someone if they did not rent from him, and evicted workers if they quit or were fired. When the Panic of 1893 hit, Pullman lowered wages by 25% while refusing to lower rent. In protest against this, as well as against working days that sometimes reached 16 hours, Pullman workers attempted to meet with their boss and present their grievances. Pullman refused to talk to them and fired 3 of the leaders. Outraged, his workers walked off the job on May 11, 1894. A young organizer named Eugene Debs started the American Railway Union, URU, in 1893. Debs believed in an industrial union that represented all white workers on the railroad, skilled and unskilled, as the key to improving their conditions. The URU opposed the traditional railroad brotherhoods that represented only elite workers and had helped break the Great Southwest Strike against Jay Gould in 1886. That the URU still discriminated based upon race represented the overwhelming racism of white workers toward non-white competition. Solidarity might extend across the working class, but it hit a brick wall on the issue of race. Despite this and despite dislike from the brotherhoods, the URU quickly found its legs, defeating the powerful James J. Hill and his Great Northern Railway in a strike. The URU had 150,000 members within a year of its founding. 4. The URU did not represent the Pullman strikers. But acting in solidarity with their fellow railroad laborers, URU members refused to move any Pullman cars. An official boycott began on June 26, and like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and the 8-hour strikes of 1886, it generated its own momentum as a larger protest against corporate domination. By June 29, 150,000 workers were on strike, and the American train system, vital to the nation's economy, ground to a halt. American labor leaders saw it as a battle not just against Pullman but all their corporate enemies. The president of the Chicago Federation of Labor said, "We all feel that in fighting any battle against the Pullman Company we are aiming at the very head and front of monopoly and plutocracy." 5. President Grover Cleveland's Attorney General was Richard Olney, former general counsel for the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway. Citing the Sherman Antitrust Act, Olney ordered federal attorneys to issue an injunction against the URU to protect his railroad friends. An injunction is a court order that compels a union to stop its action, often through hefty fines that quickly bankrupt the union. It is the classic state intervention on behalf of employers. The URU refused to obey the injunction. Cleveland and Olney then called in the military to squash the strike. Commanded by General Nelson A. Miles, known for his role in crushing the last Native American resistance in the West, 12,000 U.S. troops, aided by U.S. Marshals, cracked down on the strike, using the pretense that it interfered with the delivery of the mail. Miles hated Debs, thought the strikers were defying the federal government, and followed through on his orders with relish. As Debs proclaimed in a speech the following year, the American Railway Union challenged the power of corporations in a way that had not previously been done. 6. This was why the government would not let them win. The Pullman strike was largely nonviolent until the military intervened. On July 7, soldiers fired into a crowd, killing at least 4 strikers and wounding around 20. The same day, the military arrested Debs and other URU leaders. Facing unbeatable state repression, the strike fell apart. After 13 strikers were killed and 57 wounded, the Pullman plant reopened on August 2. Eugene Debs served 6 months in prison for violating the injunction and spent his time reading Karl Marx. He became a socialist and emerged as the greatest leader for working-class rights the country had ever seen. 7. Pullman showed yet again that the government would assist corporations in destroying working-class movements. But it did not have to be that way. If the government responded to strikes more favorably, how might workers fare? By the 1890s, the center of Colorado gold mining had settled around Cripple Creek, where prosperity bloomed. Miners desperate for work moved there during the Panic of 1893. The glut of workers led the owners to increase the workday to 10 hours from 8, with no pay raise. Disgusted, the workers joined the Western Federation of Miners, WFM, a new industrial union organizing the hard rock miners of the American West. They went on strike on February 7, 1894, just a few months before Pullman. By the end of February, nearly every gold mine in Colorado had shut down. A few owners restored the 8-hour day and their workers came back. However, most brought in scab labor. At first, the WFM tried to organize these men into the union, but the strikebreakers kept working and the strikers upped the ante. On March 16, a group of armed miners captured and beat 6 sheriff's deputies heading up to a mine at Victor, where they were to assist in the protection of scabs. At that point, El Paso County Sheriff M.F. Bowers requested the governor send the state militia to break the strike. But Colorado voters had recently elected a reformer named Davis Waite. The rare pro-worker governor during this era, Waite refused. Bowers arrested the strike leaders, but a jury found them not guilty of the trumped-up charges. Strikers continued attacking the strikebreakers, throwing bricks and getting into fistfights with them. When the miners rejected an offer to return to work for 8 hours but with reduced pay, and with Waite's refusal to use the militia as the personal army of the mine owners, the owners decided to raise a private army of mostly ex-policemen to become sheriff's deputies. On May 24, miners took over the Strong Mine, near Victor. When 125 deputies marched to take it, the miners blew it up. The deputies fled, but the miners wanted blood. Many of the miners wanted to systematically blow up the mines. They filled a railroad car with dynamite and sent it down the track, hoping to cause an explosion in the deputies' camp, but it derailed. Tensions rose even further when the mine owners paid for an additional 1,200 deputies for their private army. At that point, Governor Waite did intervene. He declared the owners' army of deputies illegal and ordered them to disband it. He sent in the state militia as a peacekeeping force and won the miners' approval to be their bargaining agent with the mine owners. The owners were apoplectic. Supporting workers is not what government did during the Gilded Age. When Waite called a meeting of the union and owners in Colorado Springs, a mob whipped up by the companies formed outside and threatened to lynch Waite and the unionists. Despite this, Waite forced the owners to restore the 8-hour day at the previous wage of $3 a day, about $73 today, the equivalent of a little more than $9 an hour for extremely dangerous work. But the owners refused to disband their forces. In Cripple Creek, they arrested hundreds of miners, formed a gauntlet, and forced townspeople to run through it while being beaten. Finally, the state militia rounded up the private police force. The governor stated he would keep the militia in Cripple Creek until the owners followed the rule of law, meaning they would have to keep paying their forces to do nothing. The employers caved and the workers ate on. This was organized labor's biggest win in the entire Gilded Age. Like the Pullman strike, the government played an absolutely crucial role in deciding its fate. Davis Wade showed that government could stand on the side of workers. This also led to the end of his political career. Mine owners made sure he lost his re-election campaign in 1894. Then they had their revenge on the miners. In Leadville, 100 miles west of Cripple Creek, 1,200 miners struck in 1896 when owners refused to raise their wages back to the 1893 standard. The strike led to owners locking out the rest of the town's miners by June 22. After its great victory at Cripple Creek, the WFM believed it could wait the owners out. When the owners hired armed strikebreakers, the union dynamited a mine. But the new governor, Albert McIntyre, was a friend to the employers and reverted to using the state militia for their interests. He sent a military guard to Leadville to reopen the mines. The WFM could not defeat armed state militiamen. Its resistance crumbled in March 1897 after half the miners had returned to work. Western state governments took a hard line against the WFM after this. It responded by growing increasingly radical, believing that only through direct action could the working class rise to power in the United States. 9. Progressives and the Anthracite Strike. Waite's actions at Cripple Creek did not lead to a new era of power for the WFM, but they did preview a new attitude politicians increasingly took toward corporations. Gilded Age excesses led to many protest movements, not only from workers but also farmers organizing themselves to escape control from eastern banks and railroads, first in the Farmers' Alliance and then the Populist Party. 10. The anarchists at Haymarket, Alexander Berkman's attempted murder of Henry Clay Frick and the assassination of President William McKinley alarmed the nation about the rising violent opposition to capitalism. Many younger people, often the sons and daughters of the Gilded Age capitalist class, wondered if the extreme income inequality of the period portended more political violence. The terrible working conditions, the poverty of the millions of immigrants coming to work in the nation's factories and sweatshops, and the children working instead of going to school deeply concerned the growing middle class. The general disorder of American society, ranging from political corruption and the waste of natural resources to poverty and unsafe food, led to rise of progressivism after 1885. This was a series of movements led by middle and upper class people who believed Americans should come together to solve society's problems, using government when necessary, but with an emphasis on voluntarism, scientific study, and investigative journalism. Jane Addams opened Hull House in Chicago to provide desperately needed services for the city's immigrants. After working there, Florence Kelley moved to New York and fought to end child labor. Theodore Roosevelt used his money and ambition to promote the conservation of the nation's resources. Not all of these reformers responded to workers' demands, but many of them did. The growing number of strikes increased the pressure. In 1896, American workers engaged in 1,026 strikes. That number rose to 3,495 in 1903, when over 531,000 workers struck. The total number of union members in the United States increased from 447,000 in 1897 to almost 2 million by 1903.11. Even Mark Hanna, the Gilded Age Ohio political boss and president of the National Civic Federation, admitted in 1901 that unions were here to stay. 12. The nation's growing industrial capacity had an almost limitless appetite for coal to fuel everything from railroads to steel mills. The number of miners in the coal country of northeastern Pennsylvania grew from 35,600 in 1870 to 126,000 by 1890, more than tripling as factories transformed the nation. 13. Even compared to the many other brutal, dangerous jobs of the period, coal mining was notorious for the lives it took. In 1869, a fire killed 110 miners at the Avondale Colliery in northeast Pennsylvania. In 1907, a fire at the Dare mine in the same state killed 239 workers. In 1909, a fire at the Cherry mine in Illinois killed 259 workers. In December 1907 alone, more than 700 coal miners died in disasters in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Alabama, and New Mexico. 14. The coal operators ran their mines like medieval fiefdoms, paying workers in company scrip instead of cash, forcing them to shop at company stores, and driving out or murdering union organizers. In Pennsylvania, anthracite miners worked a minimum of 10 hours a day. They lacked access to fresh air from the mine shafts. Instead, dangerous gases built up, leading to deadly explosions. Mine owners rarely repaired problems unless workers died. Companies took back as much of the measly wages they paid out as possible through a series of fines for impurities in the rock, through paying by the ton, with a weight more than the standard 2,000 pounds, and by forcing workers to spend their own unpaid time shoring up mine ceilings to keep them from collapsing. 15. Responding to these conditions, miners created the United Mine Workers of America, UMWA, in 1890. In a hyper-competitive industry suffering from overproduction and low coal prices, organizing was hard going. If the UMWA raised wages in Illinois, those mines had to compete with non-union mines in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. In 1897, the UMWA won a big victory in the Midwest, leading to improved wages and working conditions as well as shorter hours. Led by its president, the dapper and handsome John Mitchell, the UMWA sought to organize Pennsylvania and West Virginia, allowing the Illinois wind to take hold. The UMWA grew from 10,000 to 150,000 members by 1900 and thus gained more union dues to organize more miners. 16. The mines of northeastern Pennsylvania had produced coal for the market since the early 19th century. This once remote region soon attracted significant capital to develop some of the largest mines in the United States. In 1842, 1,500 men walked off the job to protest wage cuts. This was the home of the Molly Maguires and of generations of unionization attempts. Each loss taught workers something: that strictly ethnic associations were not sufficient, that organized political action was more effective than spontaneous protest, and that solidarity across the coal workforce was necessary for victory. These were hard-learned lessons and often relearned as unions rose and fell. The Knights of Labor briefly organized here, but Protestant miners, largely from England, Wales, and Scotland, and wanting to preserve their own ethnic privileges, created the Amalgamated Association of Miners and Laborers as an alternative to the broad-based unionism of the Knights. Over time, these miners coalesced in the UMWA. By 1894, it had become an important presence in northeastern Pennsylvania, even though English-speaking miners held their co-workers from southern and eastern Europe in contempt. 17. The mine owners responded to strikes with state-sponsored violence. In 1897, when strikers marched to shut down a mine near Latimer, Pennsylvania, the police opened fire and killed 19 workers by shooting them in the back. 18. Hardly an isolated incident, the Latimer massacre summed up employers' feelings about mine worker organizing. George Baer, president of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, headed the Anthracite Operators Association. Baer was notoriously arrogant, almost a comic stereotype of a Gilded Age plutocrat. He explained his view of labor relations in a letter titled, Divine Right of Capital. He wrote, "The rights and interests of the laboring man will be protected and cared for, not by the labor agitators, but by the Christian men to whom God in his infinite wisdom has given the control of the property interests of the country." 19. Somehow, the Pennsylvania miners disagreed with sentiment. Thanks to committed organizers such as Mary Harris, Mother Jones, rank-and-file activism, and John Mitchell's leadership, a small strike led to a victory in the mines of northeastern Pennsylvania in 1899. In 1900, the UMWA launched another strike, this one lasting 6 weeks and leading Mark Hanna to convince the mine owners to settle and pay a 10% wage increase in order to not hurt President McKinley's chances during his re-election campaign. With increased confidence but facing operators furious at concessions already granted, the UMWA increased its demands. By 1902, Mitchell pressed for union recognition, a pay raise of 20%, the eighth-hour day, a new system to weigh coal that would not cheat the miners, and the establishment of a grievance system that would allow resolution of disputes between employers and workers. Baer and the coal operators rejected it completely. They wanted to take back control of their mines. Baer said, "There cannot be two masters in the management of the business." 20. Mitchell did not want to strike. He hoped to mediate the conflict as he had in 1900. But with workers ready for a fight and the coal operators rejecting everything the union offered, he had little choice. On May 12, 100,000 miners walked off the job. It soon rose to 150,000. It would last for more than 5 brutal months, as impoverished miners took on the nation's most powerful corporate elites. The UMWA managed to hold the strike together, raising money and building political support for their actions. Mitchell immediately took on a conciliatory tone, discouraging other workers from walking out in solidarity, an action known as a sympathy strike, and calling for mediation. Meanwhile, the miners themselves enforced the picket line. Polish workers threw rocks at their countrymen who tried to scab, while other strikers captured scabs imported from elsewhere, stripped them, and paraded them through town. 21 calls grew in eastern newspapers to crush the strike, playing up the anti-scab violence and complaining of the utter disregard of the property rights either of corporations or of individuals, by strikers digging small amounts of coal to heat their own homes. 22. The miners had more power than other workers because American cities were heated on coal. Anthracite coal burns cleanly, with little smoke, so consumers bought it to heat their homes, as opposed to the dirtier bituminous coal used to fuel industry. As the summer went on, the impending coal shortage worried policymakers. Pressure grew for a settlement. Mark Hanna once again called for negotiations, and even ex-President Grover Cleveland, notorious buster of the Pullman strike, agreed. As winter approached, Americans worried how they would stay warm. President Theodore Roosevelt found the strike alarming. He also worried about the impact the coal shortage would have on congressional Republicans in the fall's midterm elections. Roosevelt first looked into mediating the strike in early June, but Attorney General Philander Knox told him he had no authority to do so. Indeed, no president had attempted this. But Roosevelt had different ideas than the presidents before him. He was a progressive, and he believed that government could act as a moderating force in the raucous Gilded Age, serving not only the interests of capitalists but those of workers and citizens too. Roosevelt frequently broke new ground in expanding the role of the president. He invited John Mitchell and the coal operators to the White House on October 3 to talk and settle the strike. 23. Mitchell jumped at Roosevelt's unprecedented action. He offered to call off the strike if the owners agreed to full presidential mediation and a small wage increase to show good faith. The coal bosses flatly refused. Roosevelt's entreaties, even refusing to talk directly to Mitchell at the meeting. The coal barons' refusal to arbitrate combined with Mitchell's conciliatory tone to move public opinion against the mine operators. The Scranton Times stated, "We have no hesitation in placing the responsibility for this industrial war where it justly belongs, upon the coal-carrying companies." 24. This was a new era that caught the coal companies off guard, one in which an aroused public wanted some level of fair treatment of workers when unions had moderate demands. That included Roosevelt. He was no friend of unions. In 1907, he would use the military to crush a strike in Nevada mines he considered dangerously radical. His goal in Pennsylvania was to mediate a difficult strike that impacted millions of Americans, not unionize the nation. Roosevelt saw the mine owners' haughty refusal to talk as a crisis of presidential authority and knew Americans wanted action. 25. His infuriated response to the coal operators was a threat to nationalize the industry, sending in the U.S. military to open the mines and employ the workers to get coal to Eastern customers. Roosevelt appealed to the powerful capitalist J. P. Morgan, a heavy investor in the Pennsylvania mines, to force the owners to acquiesce. The president spoke of Mitchell's moderation and his behavior in the face of Bayer's hatred. Roosevelt wrote of the UMWA leader, "He made no threats and resorted to no abuse. The proposition he made seemed to me eminently fair. The operators refused even to consider it, used insolent and abusive language about him, and in at least 2 cases assumed an attitude toward me which was one of insolence." 26. Roosevelt's entreaties convinced Morgan to support mediation. On October 23, the UMWA ended the strike after 165 days. 27. Clarence Darrow, at the height of his career defending the nation's poor and oppressed against corporate power, represented the workers before the Anthracite Coal Strike Commission. He said, "When I think of the cripples, of the orphans, of the widows, of the maimed who are dragging their lives out on account of this business, who, if they were mules or horses would be cared for, but who are left and neglected, it seems to me this is the greatest indictment of this business that can possibly be made." 28 workers testified about how mine bosses ripped them off by underestimating the weight of the coal they cut, their often fatal working conditions, the months during the year when the mines closed and they had no work, and the long, hard days when they did have work. They discussed the sheer physical brutality of the work, the ear-splitting noise, the scorching heat in the summer, the devastating cold in the winter, how the sharp coal cut their hands and severed their fingers. 29. In response, Baer ranted about the natural right of employers to advance society through their monopolies, while accusing unions of creating a monster monopoly that produces nothing. He claimed the union was a violent organization that did not deserve legitimacy. He defended the long hours of work and coal operators' right to total control over their miners by stating, "The masses of men have advanced, and are continuing to advance under the powerful stimulus which individual liberty gives to individual initiative. Any employer behavior was justified under Bayer's extremist position." 30. Finally, Baer simply denied the miners' humanity, stating, "These men don't suffer. Why, hell, half of them don't even speak English." 31. On March 18, 1903, the commission made its decision. The UMWA did not win everything, as the Commission did not grant the union exclusive bargaining rights, but it did give workers a 10% wage increase and reduced the working day by an hour, to 9 hours a day. In lieu of union recognition, the Commission created a mediation bargaining board. Baer was outraged and Darrow disappointed. The Commission hardly ensured industrial peace. Without the companies recognizing the union as the workers' bargaining agent, they would continue their war on the UMWA. The Commission did not limit child labor in the mines, a major goal of the union. However, even this limited advancement was one of the greatest strike victories in American history to that time, thanks to Roosevelt's intervention. The sheer idea that the government would mediate a strike instead of serve the owners marked a new day in the history of American labor's relationship with the government. 32. Even with government mediation in 1902, the UMWA could not continue building upon its momentum. Membership declined from 37,000 in mid-1904 to only 23,000 by the end of 1907. The constant flow of new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe entering the mines required endless organizing, and existing members dropped out and stopped paying dues or attending union meetings. The Anthracite Board of Conciliation, created to mediate conflicts between the owners and miners, usually favored employers, angering miners. Unable to press the union's agenda, Mitchell and the UMWA agreed in 1906 to a 3-year extension of the status quo. An internal rebellion forced Mitchell out in 1908, in part because UMWA members saw him as too cozy with the mine owners. Ultimately, a government mediating board was more favorable than total industry control over employees, but it was no avenue for worker power. 33. The progressive state, its potential and its limitations. Despite Roosevelt's outsized personality, his action in 1902 was not an isolated incident. Progressivism seeped through American government by 1910. States passed new laws to limit worker exploitation. Employers challenged them in the courts, but progressives began changing the courts as well. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court continued to embrace the right of contract created in the early 19th century, effectively arguing that if a worker took a job, that worker agreed to whatever the employer offered and the government should not intervene in that sacrosanct arrangement. Such a worldview completely ignored the vast disparities of power between an employer and a worker desperate to eat. New York had one of the nation's strongest progressive movements. In 1895, the state legislature passed the Bake Shop Act, regulating the sanitary conditions of bakeries and limiting employees to 60-hour workweeks with no more than 10 hours a day. In 1899, Joseph Lochner, a baker in Utica, was indicted for violating the act by requiring employees to labor for more than 60 hours. He drew a $25 fine. He was charged again in 1901. This time the state fined him $50 and sentenced him to up to 50 days in jail if he did not pay the fine. Lochner appealed, and the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1905, the court decided Lochner v. New York and overturned the law, asking, is this a fair, reasonable, and appropriate exercise of the police power of the state, or is it an unreasonable, unnecessary and arbitrary interference with the right of the individual to his personal liberty or to enter into those contracts in relation to labor which may seem to him appropriate or necessary for the support of himself and his family? And answering definitively for the latter, the court effectively ruled that corporations had full rights to set any conditions of employment they chose. Progressives and workers suffered a horrible defeat. 34. Yet just 3 years later, in the case of Muller v. Oregon, the court made an exception to restrict working hours for women. In 1903, Oregon passed a law limiting women to 10 hours of work a day and 60 hours a week. Progressives saw women as not only exploited workers but also mothers responsible for raising the next generation of Americans. They argued that the state had a unique interest in accepting women from the freedom of contract ideology of Lochner and the Gilded Age courts. 35 Kurt Muller, a Portland laundry owner, sued the state over the law. Muller believed that his workers freely agreed to the terms of hours and wages when they took the job. The National Consumers League, led by the pioneering labor feminist Florence Kelley, defended Oregon's law and convinced the brilliant rising lawyer Louis Brandeis to file a lengthy brief about the terrible lives of female workers. He used 4 specific arguments. First, women were physically different and weaker than men. Second, damage to women's health on the job might affect their reproductive capacity. Third, the health of children might be damaged if the mother was overworked. Fourth, long workdays deprived family members of their wife and mother. The court accepted this rationale and upheld the law, shocking employers. 36 Although some feminists opposed this ruling because it treated women as different from men, creating any exception to Lochner opened up the court to more exceptions. Muller served as a first leak in the dam holding back all workers' rights. It chipped away at the freedom of contract ideology, and within a decade, many industries would have 8-hour days. 37 Workers were not helpless victims waiting for the middle class to save them. Rather, their activism attracted reformers such as Brandeis and Kelley. The young immigrant female workers in New York's apparel industry sweatshops labored 65 to 75 hours a week when there was work. If orders declined, workers could be laid off at any time. Women earned from $3 to $10 a week, poverty wages even at the higher level. Bosses required workers to supply their own materials, such as needles, and docked their pay for the slightest infraction. Factory owners locked doors so workers could not sneak outside for breaks and required that workers request permission to use the bathroom. In 1909, those immigrant young women workers went on strike in what became known as the Uprising of the 20,000. At a November meeting, New York, progressives and labor leaders, including American Federation of Labor head Samuel Gompers, urged caution. After listening to this for 2 hours, a sweatshop worker named Clara Lemlich stood up and spoke to the workers in Yiddish, saying, "I am a working girl, one of those who are on strike against intolerable conditions. I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in general terms. What we are here for is to decide whether we shall or shall not strike. I offer a resolution that a general strike be declared. Now." 38. This is what the angry workers wanted to hear. The strike began the next day. Over 700 women were arrested in the next month. Lemlich suffered 6 broken ribs when police beat her. A 10-year-old girl was arrested and sentenced to forced labor for assaulting a scab. But public opinion turned against the operators. Wealthy women, moved by the brutality these working women faced, began joining them on the picket line and bailing the arrested women out of jail. Among them were future Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins and, in a sign of generational transition, Anne Morgan, the daughter of the capitalist J.P. Morgan, who had been behind coal operator resistance to the Pennsylvania anthracite strike just a few years before. The strike lasted for 11 weeks, and the workers won some slight gains. The work week was reduced to 52 hours and workers received 4 paid holidays per year. Additionally, workers would no longer be required to buy their own work materials, and a general agreement was reached to negotiate pay rates with workers. But they did not win on the key issue of workplace safety. 39. Owners preferred the risk of killing easily replaceable workers to investing in workplace safety. The Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York was owned by Max Blank and Isaac Harris, Jewish immigrants who made their fortune as the Shirtwaist Kings by manufacturing a woman's undergarment popular in this era. They set up a sweatshop on 3 floors of the Ash Building in Manhattan's Greenwich Village and hired workers, mostly young women, for very low pay. One corner of the factory was known as the kindergarten, where young girls sat for 12 hours, snipping thread. The average working day for all workers was 12 to 14 hours, at least 6 days a week. That included Saturday, which was important because 60% of the workers were Jewish women. During the peak production season, workers had to labor all 7 days. A sign above the elevator read, "If you don't come in on Sunday, don't come in on Monday." Blank and Harris had led the industry opposition to the uprising of the 20,000, criticizing smaller operations who signed contracts with the union and asserting their right to complete control over the factory. 40. On March 25, 1911, at the end of a long shift on a Saturday afternoon, a fire broke out in the factory. Of the 250 workers on the 9th floor, 146 died, many jumping to the streets below to escape the flames. Clara Lemlich said, "If Triangle had been a union shop there would not have been any locked doors, and the girls would have been on the street almost an hour before the fire started." 41 reporter William Gunn Shepard, who also witnessed the fire and the horrors of young women jumping to their death, noted, "I remembered the great strike of last year, in which these girls demanded more sanitary workrooms and more safety precautions in the shops. These dead bodies told the results." 42. The combination of consumers witnessing the death of workers and progressives' new ideas about government led to reforms. Investigations showed that half the city's workers labored on floors higher than fire department ladders could reach, most in factories with iron bars blocking fire escapes, overcrowded conditions, or in rickety wooden buildings. Lemlich demanded the investigating commission accompany union leaders on unscheduled factory visits to get the real story. The inspections created wide-reaching laws that began the reform of labor conditions in this country, including new standards for lighting, ventilation, and sanitation, fire exit laws, and limitations on the hours women and children could work. On the other hand, Blank and Harris were found not guilty of manslaughter and escaped justice. 43. The same progressive impulse that provided mediation for the United Mine Workers in 1902, Muller, and the Triangle reforms continued providing limited interventions in the workplace to alleviate the worst exploitation of workers. After the 1909 Cherry Mine fire in Illinois, which killed 259 workers, the state crafted new safety laws for mines that included safety training, certification for those in charge of safety equipment, and better firefighting equipment. It also helped convince Congress to establish the United States Bureau of Mines in 1910, to oversee mine safety. 44 states began to pass workers' compensation laws in 1911 after juries started finding in favor of injured and dead workers in lawsuits about workplace safety. Realizing a new day had dawned, industry decided to promote a system of limited liability rather than take the chance to lose large sums of money in the courts. Workers' compensation provided only a fraction of lost wages, but it was an improvement on the nothing injured workers had received earlier. 45. The progressive interest in workers had sharp limits. For instance, meatpackers lived lives of great brutality. The largest and most profitable sector of the Chicago economy, the packing plants employed thousands of workers, increasingly immigrants from Eastern Europe, along with growing numbers of African American workers brought in as strikebreakers during the industry's frequent strikes, a strategy to divide workers by race. Many black workers, facing hostility from unions, rightfully believed the only way they could get a factory job was through strike breaking. Once again, white hostility to workers of color interfered with class solidarity. 46. Regardless of race, meatpackers suffered from low wages and extremely dangerous working conditions, with near-freezing temperatures leading to frigid hands using sharp tools to disassemble the animals flying rapidly through the factory. Carcasses frequently smashed workers in the head, and water on the factory floor often led to electrocution. In 1906, the journalist and novelist Upton Sinclair published The Jungle to expose meatpackers' lives to the public, hoping to convert Americans to socialism. However, his middle-class audience largely ignored the plight of the workers and instead focused on the unsanitary conditions of the meat, which Sinclair described in grotesque detail. His book led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, which created the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, but readers, including Theodore Roosevelt, showed much more concern about themselves than they did the workers making the meat. 47. Moreover, most progressives did not support union power. They feared it and wanted a slightly regulated capitalism to undermine radicalism. Harrison Gray Otis, editor of the staunchly conservative Los Angeles Times, was proud of his role in keeping that city a bastion of anti-unionism. In 1910, two leaders of the International Association of Bridge and Structural Iron Workers bombed the Times building. Unfortunately, the bomb went off early, killing 21 workers. This act bewildered progressives, who struggled to understand such violence. In response to this and other violent acts, the government created the United States Commission on Industrial Relations, USCIR, in August 1912 to investigate the conditions of work. When Woodrow Wilson stepped into the presidency in 1913, he empowered the commission to expose the realities of American work. Said the groundbreaking journalist Walter Lippmann, the 9 members of the Industrial Relations Commission have before them the task of explaining why America, supposed to become the land of promise, has become the land of disappointment and deep-seated discontent. 48. Led by Frank Walsh, a Kansas City lawyer who determined that corporate heads would answer for their actions, the USCIR hearings became one of the most remarkable moments in American history. For the first time, industrial leaders had to testify about the conditions of American labor in front of a government committee. Between 1913 and 1915, the USCIR interviewed hundreds of people about the conditions of American work. Investigators in the Northwest discovered stories of logging camp cooks infected with venereal disease and still allowed to prepare food, loggers beaten by owners and having their money stolen, and workers getting so sick from timber camp food that they could not work for weeks. One investigator, writing about miners at U.S. Steel operations in Duluth, detailed how the police, owners, and city leaders conspired to crush a strike. Everyday workers told their stories and capitalists faced unprecedented public criticism. The Masses, one of the most important radical journals of the era, went so far as to call it the beginning of an indigenous American revolutionary movement. 49. That was an overstatement, but the relevance of the commission grew throughout the investigations. Colorado Fuel and Iron, CF&I, a mining and smelting company owned by the Rockefeller family, treated their largely Mexican, Italian, and Greek coal mining workforce in their southern Colorado mines with the same level of contempt that coal operators did in West Virginia and Pennsylvania. Colorado had passed laws regulating coal mines, but CF&I ensured that none of them were enforced. Workers lived in company houses that CF&I agents could enter at any time. They had to shop at the company store using company script, and anyone associated with unions faced termination. The United Mine Workers of America organized the workers, and in 1913 they presented CF&I with a series of demands that included an 8-hour day, the right of workers to choose their own homes and doctors, a pay raise, and enforcement of mine safety laws. The company rejected it and the miners went on strike. CF&I kicked strikers out of company housing, but the union had anticipated this and had leased land nearby for tent cities. CF&I hired the notorious Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a Pinkerton-like anti-union strike-breaking firm, to harass the strikers. The agency helped CF&I buy 4 machine guns from the West Virginia coal Operators Association and mounted two on an armored vehicle known as the Death Special, and they set up additional snipers to shoot into the tent camps. 50 Colorado Governor Elias Ammons called in the Colorado National Guard to restore order and gave state forces to the company for their use for the winter. On April 20, 1914, CF&I and National Guard forces opened fire on the camp and a day-long battle raged. After killing Union leader Louis Ticas with the butt of a rifle, they set the camp on fire. Fearing the snipers, many camp residents dug cellars underneath the tents to hide. 4 women and 11 children, including 2 infants named Elvira Valdez and Frank Petrucci, went into the cellars during the day. They suffocated to death. It was the death of these 15 innocents that led to this event being known as the Ludlow Massacre. The well-armed strikers did not meekly return to work. Furious and wanting revenge, they began their own campaign of violence against the militia and scabs. The Colorado State Federation of Labor told the strikers to organize the men in your community in companies of volunteers to protect the workers of Colorado against the murder and cremation of men, women, and children. 51 A 10-day guerrilla war ensued with high casualties on both sides. Somewhere between 69 and 199 people died. Miners destroyed mine buildings and tunnels and even blew up the dam that provided drinking water for the Ludlow mines. Finally, Woodrow Wilson sent in the U.S. Army to end the hostilities. Unlike in previous examples of federal intervention in strikes, Wilson ordered neutrality, and in fact the Army arrested several militia members. By December, however, the UMWA had run out of funds and the strike ended in a total defeat. 52. After the Ludlow Massacre, Frank Walsh called John D. Rockefeller Jr. before the USCIR and publicly humiliated the powerful man for his company thugs and indifference to workers' lives. Never before had a capitalist been embarrassed publicly for his actions concerning workers. A shocked and humbled Rockefeller sought to make sure this would never happen again by creating what became known as a company union. He intended to give workers a limited voice to air their concerns and improve working conditions, while keeping power in the hands of his mine managers. For all the very real limitations of company unions that workers would chafe against and eventually reject, this was a concession to a new era of government interest in ensuring fair conditions for workers. 53. Opinion on the final report from the USCIR was divided, with more conservative elements outraged by Walsh's criticism of capitalists. In the end, progressives' intervention in the workplace led to only limited improvements in workers' lives, most of which came only in the aftermath of workers expressing power through strikes or dying in horrifying tragedies. For the middle class, government involvement garnered optimism in the future. However, events like those at the Triangle Factory and in Ludlow also contributed to many workers seeing no hope in capitalism. Without real power, the occasional government mediation that helped coal workers in Pennsylvania or a government committee to investigate why workers blew up a newspaper building would do little for workers. Instead, a lot of workers looked at the assassination attempt on Henry Clay Frick or the Los Angeles Times bombing as a model for action. The radicalism that resulted would shake the nation to its core. 5. The Bread and Roses Strike. When capitalism fails workers, radicals can mobilize them to fight. By 1910, the progressive movement had brought middle-class reformers into alliance with workers on some issues. The United States Commission on Industrial Relations provided an unprecedented investigation into the exploitation workers faced and transformed the conversation about worker rights. American society became a little fairer. Those changes meant very little to the daily life of a worker struggling to eat and working 60 hours a week in a dangerous factory or mine for low wages. The rank exploitation workers faced, their terrible housing, their malnutrition, the horrifyingly unsafe working conditions, meant capitalism had failed millions of workers. Lacking any hope for change, they would sometimes turn to violence in their anger and frustration, from Haymarket to the Los Angeles Times bombing. The American Federation of Labor refused to organize the most exploited workers, such as immigrants toiling in sweatshops and steel mills, African Americans, Asian Americans, loggers, and farm workers. All sorts of radical ideologies helped fill this vacuum. The anarchism that came to the nation's attention at Haymarket, the socialism embodied by Eugene Debs, and many other alternatives to capitalism appealed in a world of desperation. But none of these ideas formed a mass organization to gather the workers into a fighting force for revolution. That changed in 1905 with the formation of the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW. Unlike the AFL, the IWW, aka Wobblies, had openly radical leadership seeking direct action from workers at the point of production to create a revolution from below. 1 Directly challenging capitalism, organizing the nation's most oppressed workers, savaging the compromising AFL with savvy propaganda, and engaging in often brilliant public relations strategies, the IWW frightened employers, government, and the AFL, who all wanted to crush the organization. Wobblies spoke a language of empowerment that brought hope to thousands of workers for the first time. It is easy for modern radicals to look at unions and see them as compromising, stodgy, and weak, and therefore view a radical front as an appealing alternative. Like a century ago, current workers seem to have no avenue for power. To harness that power, though, we need to avoid romanticizing these radicals and understand when their ideas and tactics worked and when they did not. The IWW had internal flaws that undermined its own ability to sustain its worker organizing. Its cavalier talk of violence and sabotage made Americans fear this organization more than necessary. Its unwillingness to build long-term worker organizations and its attraction to the next big struggle meant that even when the IWW won a campaign, untrained workers found themselves at the mercy of employers after the IWW organizers moved on. Constant infighting and factional debates over ideology interfered with organizing workers. None of this was fatal to the IWW. Rather, the organization's radicalism directly challenged capitalism, and the state struck back hard. The progressive state might sometimes help workers, but it could use its power against them. During and after World War I, in the first widespread crackdown on radicals in American history, the administration of Woodrow Wilson, the military, and employers violently repressed the IWW, leading to massive civil liberties violations and the nation's first period of anti-communist hysteria. It again demonstrates how the state response to unions, conservative or radical, goes far to determine their fate. Radical America. Despite Theodore Roosevelt's interference in the Pennsylvania anthracite strike, the state still crushed worker movements far more often than it helped them. In the aftermath of the state oppression the Western Federation of Miners, WFM, faced in the 1890s and early 1900s, that union pioneered the path to the IWW. Its leaders realized that only large-scale industrial unionism could fight the aggressive and repressive tactics of American corporations. In 1902, it named Big Bill Haywood its secretary-treasurer, aligning it with the Socialist Party. Haywood had started working in the Nevada mines at the age of 15 and became a union organizer after he injured his hands working in Idaho. He wore the scars of American work across his body and would seek to redress the injustice in American life through organizing for a radical alternative to capitalism. The WFM had ambitious goals of expanding its organizing into the South and Midwest and translated its constitution into multiple languages to attract more immigrants. It started organizing non-miners in Colorado, targeting refineries in Colorado City, where a strike took place in February 1903. The governor called in the state militia to stop the picketing and a full-blown war on the Union began in Colorado. When the strike reached Cripple Creek, home of the WFM's great 1894 victory, the militia officer in charge, General Sherman Bell, said, "I came to do up this damned anarchistic federation." The governor declared martial law in Cripple Creek in December. WFM President Charles Moyer was thrown in prison, and after the bombing of a train car of strikebreakers, a vigilante group rounded up dozens of WFM workers and deported them to Kansas and New Mexico. 3. Devastated, the WFM turned to radical action nationwide, hoping to create a broad-based organization fighting for the rights of all workers. In June 1905, the WFM joined radicals from around the nation in Chicago to form the Industrial Workers of the World. Eugene Debs was there, a decade after the brutal crushing of the Pullman strike, as was the legendary matron saint of the United Mine Workers of America, Mary Harris, Mother Jones. Socialist Labor Party leader Daniel De Leon wanted to control this new organization so he could lead a revolutionary movement. Lucy Parsons, anarchist, African-American, and widow of Haymarket martyr Albert Parsons, attended. So did Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the rebel girl, who would inspire thousands with her impassioned speeches. WFM leaders played a critical role. Big Bill Haywood stated the IWW's goal was to form a working-class movement that shall have for its purpose the emancipation of the working class from the slave bondage of capitalism. 4. The IWW rejected AFL-style craft unionism. William Troutman, one of the new union's founders, noted at the convention, the Directory of Unions of Chicago shows in 1903 a total of 56 different unions in the packing houses, divided up still more in 14 different national trades unions of the American Federation of Labor. What a horrible example of an army divided against itself in the face of a strong combination of employers. 5. Instead, the IWW called for direct action by workers, putting power in their hands to make their own battle against capitalism. 6. The variety of radicals meant the organization had no set ideological framework. Eventually, the IWW became known for its version of anarcho-syndicalism, in which workers would win power not through violent revolution but through a general strike of all workers that would grind the economy to a halt and allow them to take over. The IWW believed that all workers should join one big union in order to overthrow the wage system that would run each industry through the control of workers. 7. It defined the general strike as the most effective weapon against capitalism. 8. But the IWW had a flexible set of ideas that shifted depending on the organizer, the campaign, and the lives of workers. It proved more effective when prioritizing organizing workers around their lived experiences than when focusing on ideological consistency. It held consistently to the idea that workers signing contracts with employers would limit their power and accept a state of oppressive capitalism. While perhaps true, this undermined the IWW's ability to build on its own victories because its leaders underestimated the power of employers to win back whatever they might have lost after a brief moment of workers organizing. And while it offered workers practical advice to avoid violence in workplace actions, many of its propagandists also had a love affair with violent rhetoric, openly talking about sabotage and dynamiting factories. Wobblies rarely did any of these things, but by embracing violent rhetoric, all employers and the police had to convince people of the IWW's danger was to publicize the union's own words. This cavalier attitude toward violence would haunt the IWW. In its first years, the IWW engaged in more infighting than organizing. The reformist socialists split with the revolutionary socialists in 1906. By 1908, the Western Federation of Miners had left their national project behind as moderates gained control over that union and returned it to the Rockies. The same year, the IWW expelled Daniel de Leon for trying to tie IWW to his Socialist Labor Party. He wanted to be America's Vladimir Lenin. This moment convinced the IWW to officially state that it would not affiliate with any political party. Some of the radicals believed the union's political goal should have focused on mobilizing a working-class vote. Others felt American democracy was worthless for workers. Like many radical organizations riven with divisive ideological fights and state repression, it seemed like the IWW would not lead to anything of importance. Yet the defeat of de Leon and the rise of Big Bill Haywood, who had escaped with a not guilty verdict after a false accusation of ordering the murder of the former governor of Idaho, stabilized the IWW and gave it more practical leadership. 9. Despite these struggles, IWW organizers seeped into the workforce. Its first adherents were loggers, miners, and farm workers in the American West, who faced brutal exploitation in dangerous and isolated workplaces. Socialist ideas already had set roots in the West, and workers were open to challenging capitalism. 10 Unsafe technologies, cave-ins, and explosions crushed miners' bodies. They became a key IWW target as their unskilled profession now turned into an industrial process that treated them like animals. 11 The IWW's first major strike took place in the mining town of Goldfield, Nevada. On December 20, 1906, workers went on strike, and within 3 weeks they won raised wages, shortened hours, and several fringe benefits, marking the IWW's first important victory. By March 1907, the IWW had 3,000 dues-paying members in Goldfield and demanded that all the town's businesses agree to the 8-hour day. After another strike in November, the mine owners and Nevada's governor collaborated to crush the union with force. Falsely claiming union violence, the state asked Roosevelt for troops to end this challenge to employers. He complied. The federal troops remained until March 1908, when the Nevada legislature created a special police force to replace them. Goldfield would be a union-free town. Already, state power determined the limits of the IWW. 12. Wobblies entered the timber industry in 1907 in Portland, Oregon, with a strike over wages. The AFL worked with industry to crush it. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, Wobbly organizers briefly united native English speakers with Hungarian immigrants to force the American Tube and Stamping Company to grant several demands. Over 1,000 workers joined an early IWW local in the silk mills of Paterson, New Jersey. The AFL worried about the new attention to a radical challenge to its control over American unionism. 13. These early actions rarely grabbed the headlines. But when the IWW challenged restrictions on free speech, it received national attention. Wobbly organizers gave radical speeches in public spaces. Disgusted, police forces repeatedly violated the Constitution by refusing to allow them to speak. In response, the IWW announced it would challenge any restrictions on free speech. It urged members to flood these cities to give more speeches, forcing police to house hundreds of prisoners and challenging the power of employers and police in brave ways. The first battle took place in Spokane, Washington. In the farming and logging industries surrounding the city, workers suffered the indignities and poverty so common in this era. Logging operations and farmers contracted with employment agencies, forcing workers to pay for a job. But if they were no longer needed when they reached the worksite, workers lost their money and had to return to Spokane and pay again. 14. The employment scam infuriated workers and made Spokane an early IWW organizing hotspot. By 1909, the city had up to 1,500 dues-paying members and a union headquarters. It expanded its presence through street speaking, its organizers making angry speeches denouncing the exploitation workers faced. In March, the city council passed an ordinance banning public speaking from all revolutionists. Arrests grew through the summer and into the fall. When Wobbly leader Jim Thompson was arrested for speaking without a permit on October 25, the IWW sent speakers from around the country to flood the city jails until they could speak freely in Spokane. Soon, 400 people were in jail, overwhelming the system. The prisoners were intentionally underfed and forced to take ice-cold outdoor showers in the winter. Many suffered long-term health problems. But the intense resistance of the IWW surprised Spokane and overwhelmed its ability to deal with the crisis of its own making. It made a deal. 15. The city freed all prisoners and allowed the IWW to hold outdoor meetings without police harassment. The employers gave up the contract labor system. But the IWW failed to build upon this victory. It could have continued the fight in Spokane. Instead, its organizers left to take up free speech fights in new towns instead of continuing to organize Spokane. The region remained an IWW stronghold for another decade. But workers would need more than high-publicity single campaigns to win power. More free speech fights in western cities continued: Aberdeen, Washington, San Diego, and Fresno, California. The Spokane free speech fight set a pattern for future IWW actions. It created public displays that attracted media attention and exposed the injustices in American life. It gave the nation's poorest and most desperate workers hope. But it also prioritized intellectual ideas of revolution and struggle over long-term worker power. 16. However, the IWW also provided critical organizing assistance when hard-pressed workers took initiative of their own. In McKees Rocks, Pennsylvania, largely immigrant workers faced the total control over their lives from their employer, the Pressed Steel Car Company, which kept them in a state of near peonage, with crowded company housing, company stores, and kickbacks from foremen expected from meager wages. The workers spontaneously struck in July 1909 after their paychecks were suddenly reduced. IWW organizers such as William Troutman provided critical organizing assistance. In August, a pitched battle erupted between the strikers and police, leaving 6 dead, but in September, the company agreed to some of the workers' demands. It seemed like the IWW's first big victory. But once again, the organization's attention was pulled away from McKees Rocks toward new struggles. When the company reneged on the agreement and instituted a company union instead, the workers were left with little to show for their struggle. 17. The IWW may have failed to produce long-term victories, but it also took on the most difficult aspects of organizing American workers, including the racial divide that routinely fractured workplace solidarity. In its belief that all workers shared the common enemy of capitalism, the IWW tried to organize black and white workers together. Doing so attacked the fundamental racial ideology of the nation. The IWW did not shy away from challenging its own members. When Big Bill Haywood traveled to Alexandria, Louisiana, to speak to wobbly loggers in 1911, he chastised the all-white meeting for acquiescing to Jim Crow laws that kept public meetings segregated, telling them, "You work in the same mills together. Sometimes a black man and a white man chop down the same tree together. You are meeting in convention now to discuss the conditions under which you labor. This can't be done intelligently by passing resolutions here and then sending them out to another room for the black men to act upon. Why not be sensible about this and call the Negroes into the convention? If it is against the law, this is one time when the law should be broken." 18. Haywood may have integrated this campaign, but racism divided many IWW members. Nonetheless, the IWW catalyzed racial solidarity in several places, including the Philadelphia docks, where the radicals provided a sharp contrast to racist AFL unions. It aggressively organized both white and black workers in a 1913 strike that revolutionized the docks in that city. As one black minister noted, "The IWW at least protects the colored man, which is more than I can say for the laws of this country." 19. All of these actions, leading to many defeats and the occasional victory, helped prepare the IWW to take on some of the most powerful industries in the United States, providing an unprecedented challenge to employer domination of workers' lives. The Bread and Roses Strike. Lawrence, Massachusetts, became a center of the New England textile industry in the 1840s. The huge cotton and woolen mills employing thousands of people dominated the city's architecture. Their ruins still do today. 40,000 Lawrence residents worked in the mills, most immigrants from Ireland and southern and eastern Europe. By 1910, 48% of Lawrence's 85,000 people were foreign-born. 20. A small tenement apartment took $6 of their $9 weekly wage. Many of these workers were women and children. Half the workers at the American Woolen Company, Lawrence's largest employer, were girls under 18 years old, toiling for little pay and breathing in cotton dust. They suffered from diseases such as tuberculosis and anthrax. The average Lawrence manufacturer had a lifespan of 58 years, but the lifespan of the Lawrence mill worker was only 39.6 years. 21. As early as the 1860s, Lawrence newspapers noted women agitators organizing and speaking out about the exploitation in the city's mills. In 1882, the workers struck after the Pacific Main Mill announced a simultaneous production increase and wage cut. Women, outraged over management's dismissal of their concerns as both workers and women, led the strike. It attracted the attention of both employers and workers throughout New England, who saw in it the future of labor relations and wages. The strikers lost, lacking support from male workers. Gender could divide workers as much as race. The city's textile workers would continue a spiral into exploitation. 22. On January 12, 1912, a new Massachusetts law went into effect that limited women's working hours to 54 a week, a reduction of 2 hours. The Lawrence workers thought employers would not reduce their pay. They were wrong, as they discovered with their reduced paycheck delivered the day before the new law went into effect. Within minutes, workers marched through the Washington Mill, shutting down the machines and announcing a strike. By the next day, the city shut down. This began the Bread and Roses strike that captured national attention, demonstrated the deep injustices American workers faced, and clearly showed both the possibilities and limitations of IWW organizing. The IWW had sent organizers to Lawrence beginning in 1907 but still had only 300 or so members in early 1912. The AFL had a tiny, United Textile Workers Union presence of about 200 members, but they gave it no resources for organizing, only focused on the English-speaking skilled mill workers, and avoided organizing any of the masses of immigrants. It would do nothing. Neither union seemed ready to pounce on the strike. However, the local IWW members asked that Joseph Eder come to Lawrence. Although only 26 years old, he was a veteran wobbly organizer, was fluent in English, Italian, and Polish, and could understand Yiddish and Hungarian. This made him an ideal person to speak to the many immigrants of Lawrence. He had come to organize for the IWW in 1910 and 1911 and was well known by the community's labor activists. His own father, a radical Italian immigrant, had been injured in the Haymarket bombing. He was the one organizer who could speak to almost all the strikers. His commitment kept the workers' spirits high in the strike's early days. He helped them develop concrete demands that included a 15% pay raise, overtime pay, and no punishment of strikers. 23. The mill owners and police responded as usual, with violence and manipulation. When agents from the American Woolen Company told workers that the mills had accepted their demands and they should return to work, a lie intended to divide the workers, Eder exploded in a righteous fury, telling a crowd, if an overseer comes into your house and invites you to betray yourself into being either a scab or a blacklisted man, throw him down the stairs. 24. The next day, incensed workers held a mass march. The police used fire hoses to spray water from the top of the mills onto the strikers in the sub-freezing temperatures. When strikers threw ice in return, 36 were arrested and sentenced to a year in prison. A young Syrian immigrant named John Rami was bayoneted to death by a militia member. The region's elite classes mobilized to suppress the strike. Harvard students volunteered as part of the strike-breaking militia, a tradition at the college going back to the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, when they formed an armed militia to defend the railroads if the strike reached New England. 25. This was a common phenomenon among university students in this era when only the richest American children could go to college. Harvard's president allowed them to make up their final exams. 26. This was a critical moment for the IWW. Wobbly theorists hoped mass strikes could spur a revolution. Lawrence was the first time that workers under wobbly leadership had engaged in a mass strike of thousands. Perhaps this would be the beginning of a larger workers' movement. Big Bill Haywood came to rally the workers. 15,000 strikers met Haywood at the train station when he arrived. He spoke in very simple language to this largely immigrant crowd with limited English. Avoiding the left's theoretical language made him accessible to the average worker. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the rebel girl, who played a major role in Lawrence, remembered how watching him talk to workers shaped her organizing for the rest of her life. 27. Yet throughout the strike, it was the rank-and-file workers, especially women, who truly led the way, understanding the street politics, deciding strategy, starting confrontations with the police and militia, and humiliating scabs. For all the IWW brought to Lawrence, it was the militancy of everyday workers, developed over a lifetime of toil and oppression, that made it happen. 28. Strikes divided communities between strikers and those who believed themselves committed to law and order, but the latter group committed most of the violent crimes in labor disputes. John Breen, a Lawrence School Board member and son of the former mayor, framed the strikers by planting bombs around town. A week before this, William Madison Wood, owner of the American Woolen Company, had paid Breen a large sum of money. This coincidence was not seriously investigated, no charges were brought against Wood, and Breen was released without serving jail time. The ploy worked. When the bombs were found, it led to the typical overheated rhetoric from the media worried about revolution, especially after the Los Angeles Times bombing 2 years earlier. The New York Times wrote, "The strikers display a fiendish lack of humanity which ought to place them beyond the comfort of religion until they have repented." 29. On January 29, the police murdered an Italian striker named Anna Lo Pizzo while breaking up a picket line. They pinned the death on the strike leaders, Joseph Eder and Arturo Giovannitti, the editor of an Italian socialist newspaper in New York who was organizing the relief effort. They were 3 miles away at the time of the killing. They rotted in prison for the next 8 months without bail or trial. Martial law followed. Once again, the authorities denied Wobblies their civil rights. 30 strikers began challenging the militia to shoot them, and it, rather than employers, became the top target of strikers' wrath. 31 Eder and Giovannitti hyped these challenges by using violent language themselves. The latter told workers to prowl around like wild animals looking for blood, while Eder threatened the use of firearms. 32 For the militia and employers, this language justified the suppression. With this strike gaining national headlines, the IWW sent its biggest names to Lawrence. Its best organizers, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and William Troutman, gave impassioned speeches. Italian anarchist Carlo Tresca followed. Big Bill Haywood returned to Lawrence and took over the day-to-day running of the strike, holding up to 10 meetings a day. He ate and socialized in workers' homes to build connections with them and held mass meetings where strikers from every different language would deliver messages to their people. 33. The IWW also developed sophisticated propaganda to nationalize this conflict. Writers came to Lawrence to tell workers' stories. Haywood visited New England textile towns raising funds, and he gave a rousing speech at Carnegie Hall in Manhattan, telling attendees the Lawrence strikers' victory depends on you, as ushers roamed the crowd for donations while coins and dollar bills rained down from the rafters. 34 With the strikers destitute, the IWW thought to place workers' children with sympathizers in different cities. This spread the Lawrence workers' cause. On February 10, 19 children boarded a train to New York dressed in their rags, with their name, age, address, and nationality pinned to them. The New York Call, a socialist paper, wrote, "Take the children. Children of the Lawrence strikers are hungry. Their fathers and mothers are fighting against hunger, and hunger may break the strike. The men and women are willing to suffer, but they cannot watch their children's pain or hear their cries for food. Workers and strike sympathizers who can take a striker's child until the struggle ends are urged to send their name and address to the call. Do it at once." 35. They all found families when they arrived, as 5,000 socialists met them at the train station to celebrate their arrival. The children's exodus was masterful propaganda. Newspaper reporters ate it up and it raised desperately needed funds. More children followed, too. Boston, Philadelphia, Vermont, New York. Another group of 92 children arrived in New York and paraded on Fifth Avenue before going to their temporary homes. In Lawrence, the attention led to more militia violence. The militia harassed, beat, and even bayoneted workers on the street. When a militia member told a man walking a dog to hurry and the owner refused, he stabbed the dog. 36. On February 24, another 150 children were to board a train to Philadelphia. The police blocked their path at the Lawrence train station, threatening to arrest the mothers. As the train approached, one woman pushed ahead, desperate for her child to get out. The police grabbed her and that spark set off a frantic rush toward the train. The police began beating the women and children. Mothers were dragged from their children into police wagons. The train left without a single child aboard. The brutality badly backfired. The national media excoriated the violence. Said the journalist Ray Stannard Baker, a man not sympathetic to the IWW, "If I were living in one of those miserable tenements, I should join any movement, however revolutionary, to put an end to such conditions." President William Howard Taft, reading about the attack, ordered the Attorney General to investigate. A congressional committee held a hearing on Lawrence, giving workers the chance to tell their stories to the most powerful people in the country. First Lady Helen Herron Taft attended. Workers testified about their poor living conditions, their poverty, and how the companies docked their pay. They even told about employers who charged them for clean drinking water. One girl testified about how a spinning frame wrenched her hair and scalped her. 37. The timing could not have been better for the IWW. The strike had begun to collapse under the weight of hunger and poverty. Nearly half of the workforce had returned to the job. But, embarrassed by the publicity, on March 12, the owners of the American Woolen Company gave in. The other companies followed. The strike was over, a huge win for the workers and the IWW. Workers received a wage increase of between 5 and 20%, with more going to the lowest paid. They received overtime pay for the first time, and all strikers could return to their jobs. Yet there was one more battle, The murder trial of Eder, Giovanni T., and Joseph Caruso, an Italian immigrant and striker later added to the indictment who never understood why he was arrested. They languished in prison until September, when their trial began. This became the IWW's major cause in the months after the strike. On September 30th, the workers engaged in a one-day walkout in support of their jailed organizers. All three were acquitted on November 26th. Only 2 years later, the union created during the Great Bread and Roses strike was dust. IWW membership in Lawrence fell from 10,000 after the strike to 400 by late 1914. Layoffs due to a 1913 economic downturn explained some of it. But the IWW did not recognize the need for long-term organizing in individual workplaces if workers were to build power. It refused to sign contracts with employers because it believed contracts limited worker action to incremental gains in a system that accepted capitalism. Maybe this could have worked had the IWW kept skilled organizers in Lawrence to continue the struggle. But Haywood and other wobbly leaders always moved on to the next big strike. The mill owners eventually repealed what they had given up in the face of public pressure. Unionization was new to the workers. They did not know how to maintain their power. Without the wobbly leadership, the workers were divided by ethnicity, a split encouraged by the employers. Union leaders were fired and blacklisted. Eder returned in 1916 to try to restart the union, but a mob grabbed him and put him on a train to Boston. The strike had won the workers some material gains, but it left them no union to keep up the fight. 39. The IWW turned to another textile town, Paterson, New Jersey, where silk workers went on strike on February 1, 1913, demanding an 8-hour day and better working conditions. Again, IWW organizing errors both helped mobilize the workers and contributed to their defeat. 40. John Reed, future chronicler of the Mexican and Russian revolutions, met Haywood when the latter came to Paterson. Reed mobilized the New York art community for the strikers. He and other artists decided to put on a performance at Madison Square Garden to show the world the great evil of the Paterson employers and the nobility of the workers' struggle, while raising money for the cause. 41 Using actual strikers telling their stories, the Paterson strike pageant received positive reviews. It also undermined the strike it purported to help. Reed had promised workers the pageant would pay to keep the strikers going, but it did not raise nearly enough money. Morale plummeted. As Elizabeth Gurley Flynn said, bread was the need of the hour, and bread was not forthcoming even from the most beautiful and realistic example of art that has been put on the stage in the last half-century. 42. Worse, the event had distracted and divided workers. With strike leaders rehearsing a theater production instead of picketing, strikebreakers found it easier to enter the mills. Only 1,000 out of the 25,000 strikers could participate in the pageant. This led to jealousy and accusations of favoritism. In early July, the English-speaking skilled ribbon workers agreed to a shop-by-shop settlement, kicked the IWW organizers out of the decision-making process, and went back to work. The immigrant workers could not stay out without the English speakers. By July 28, the strike had collapsed in a total defeat for the workers and the IWW. Never again would the IWW organize a large walkout among the Eastern immigrant working class. 43. The IWW and Western workers. Reeling from Paterson, the IWW returned to the West, where the extractive economy in the agriculture, mining, and timber industries sought mobile, highly exploitable workers. IWW organizers also began thinking more pragmatically than in Paterson and Lawrence, letting workers set the demands, which usually revolved around concrete material gains that meant something to workers' impoverished lives instead of cultural productions and media events. In the face of tremendous violence, workers found in the IWW a vehicle to articulate their outrage and despair, as well as their hopes and dreams. The violence of workers' lives should shock us. Ralph Durst's hop farm in Wheatland, California, was the largest agricultural employer in the state. Durst sent flyers across the West advertising for hop pickers, telling of ample work and good wages. He lied. By late July 1913, around 2,800 men, women, and children had arrived in Wheatland. Durst recruited far more workers than the 1,500 he needed in order to lower wages to suit him. Workers could rent a tent for $2.75 a week, but a lot of people lived in the open, with a pallet for a floor. Most made less than $1.50 a day, about $37 today, for 12 hours of work. 2,800 people shared 8 toilets, resulting in predictable filth and sickness. For 5 days in a row, the temperature reached 105 degrees. Durst refused to provide workers water, and the nearest wells were a mile away. Workers appealed for the promised wages, free water, and better living spaces. Durst ignored them. IWW member Richard Blackie Ford called for a strike. The police served as Durst's private military. One cop grabbed Ford off the speaker's platform and arrested him. When a gun fired, an already angry group of people turned violent. Over the next few minutes, a fierce battle raged between the police and workers. 4 people died, 2 workers, a deputy sheriff, and Yuba County District Attorney E.T. Manuel. The state railroaded Ford and another wobbly leader, Herman Sir, into prison on trumped-up murder charges. That neither had killed anyone did not matter. Both received life sentences. 44. Such violence occurred repeatedly in the West. In Everett, Washington, in 1916, vigilantes opened fire when a boat full of wobblies attempted to dock at the logging town to protest previous vigilante and police violence against its members. Between 5 and 12 wobblies were killed, some of whom were never found because they were shot off the boat into the water. 45 time and again, in the free speech fights at Lawrence and Patterson, at Wheatland and Everett, workers could not receive justice under capitalism. Organizers were thrown into prison for the audacity of challenging employers. Street speakers were subjected to health-destroying conditions in jails for simply expressing their First Amendment rights. This treatment became a staple of wobbly literature, demonstrating the pointlessness of acquiescing to the system. Yet, the IWW gave the police and employers all the evidence they needed to see the Union as a dangerous revolutionary threat. The IWW promoted arson and other tools of undermining production as central pillars of its strategy for defeating capitalism. Haywood insisted that revolutionary politics were impossible without industrial sabotage. Talk of blowing up buildings, setting forest fires, and destroying corporate properties scared employers. The IWW did not have to do any of these things for their words to be used against them. In fact, the number of actual incidents of sabotage was surprisingly small. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn later aptly called it infantile leftism. 46 After Wheatland, IWW newspapers published articles calling for arson. When a cannery in San Jose burned, there was no evidence tying it to IWW sabotage, but continued wobbly calls for a campaign of arson to free the Wheatland prisoners convinced authorities that the IWW was a terrorist organization burning businesses. 47. The macho attitude toward violence of a few IWW organizers should not obscure the fact that thousands of workers saw the Wobblies as their best hope for their future. That became increasingly true as IWW organizers based their campaigns on winning concrete gains for workers, letting them set the agenda. The commitment of wobbly organizers to revolution had not changed, but they did increasingly recognize the need to reach rank and file workers in their lived experiences and use those as an organizing technique to move them toward radical activity. Loggers in the Northwest lived particularly brutal lives, even compared to other workers of the day. Carrying their waterlogged and flea-infested bedrolls on their backs from camp to camp, loggers suffered through respiratory illnesses, filth, and miserable discomfort. Housing was drafty, overcrowded, and abundant in vermin. Bathing facilities and sanitary toilets were almost unknown. New technologies lacking safety precautions killed and maimed workers daily. After 1912, organizers began to focus on the lived experiences of workers, slowly working towards the victories the IWW could not achieve in Lawrence and Patterson. A June 1913 strike list of demands included not only the 8-hour day and $3 a day but also towels and soap for bathing, clean sanitary bunkhouses, with mattresses and blankets, and safety equipment around dangerous machinery in the mills. In publicizing the strike, the IWW asked, "Are you dissatisfied with living in miserable bunkhouses? If so, refuse to work under bad conditions, demand better camp conditions and pure food." 50 camps shut down during this brief strike. These actions slowly built IWW membership over the next 2 years. By 1917, the Wobblies had made themselves the single organization fighting for workplace democracy in the logging camps. 48. The IWW made similar gains in other industries. In 1915, it created the Agricultural Workers Organization, AWO, to organize migratory farm workers. Like the timber organizers, the AWO's chief organizer, Walter Neff, focused on concrete gains for workers, such as a 10-hour day, a minimum wage, overtime pay, and better housing. By that summer, it won better conditions for workers in Kansas and had 1,500 members in North Dakota. It established offices throughout the Midwest, and by the fall of 1916 it had 20,000 members across the region. Miners in Minnesota's Mesabi Range, seeing the AWO's success, wrote to Neff asking for Italian and Slavic language organizers to come to the mines. Neff did not have those, but workers struck anyway, and by July 1916, the newly created Metal Mine Workers Industrial Union No. 490 had 4,000 members. Even though the companies crushed the strike, they also granted many of the miners' demands, fearful of more organizing. Sometimes the workers could win even if the IWW lost. 49. Repression. The government never really tolerated radicalism. But when the United States entered World War I in 1917, the sheer existence of the IWW became intolerable for law enforcement, for business, and for the administration of Woodrow Wilson. In 1917, 1 million workers struck during 4,500 strikes, alarming employers around the country. Most of these strikes had nothing to do with the IWW, but growing worker activism frightened employers and concerned the government, which was using its growing powers under progressive presidents to coordinate production of war materials. 50 IWW leadership equivocated on the war. Haywood feared state repression if it opposed the war. He and other IWW leaders told Wobblies to make their own decisions. It made no difference. The IWW's reputation for violence, partially earned through its own rhetoric, made it a target. Policymakers drew a sharp divide between the AFL and the IWW. Wilson wanted to bring respectable labor into wartime planning, and the AFL saw him as the most pro-union president to date. In fact, many unionists believed Wilson more favorable to their cause than any previous president. When Wilson signed the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914, giving labor limited protections from injunctions, AFL head Samuel Gompers called it labor's Magna Carta, and Wilson's signing of the La Follette-Siemens Act in 1915 gave unprecedented ability to sailors to escape their oppressive conditions upon docking in the United States. 51 These were big wins for the mainstream labor movement. The AFL, the Wilson administration, and especially employers could also all agree that World War I was an opportunity to eliminate the IWW entirely. 52 Phelps Dodge, one of the world's largest copper mining companies, operated on both sides of the U.S.-Mexican border. In 1916, the AFL-affiliated International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers had about 1,800 mostly native-born American members in Bisbee, a town in southern Arizona near the border. There, the IWW organized the most marginalized workers, Mexicans and Eastern European immigrants. On June 24, 1917, the IWW presented Phelps Dodge with a list of demands, including better living and working conditions and non-discrimination against union workers. The copper company refused to negotiate. By June 27, about 50% of Bisbee miners struck. Phelps Dodge used the war as a pretext to crush the IWW entirely. On July 12, 2,000 men assembled to cleanse the town of the Wobblies. They gathered 1,186 men suspected of radicalism and marched them to waiting trains and shoved them onto cattle cars knee-deep in manure. The train dumped them in the desert near the New Mexico-Arizona border. The Bisbee deportation crushed the unions in the town. 53 Frank Little was one of the IWW's most skilled and radical organizers. He was in Bisbee, where beatings left him physically broken but as determined as ever. Then, he left for Butte, Montana, where he attempted to organize an angry community after the Speculator mine fire had killed 168 miners. Little had mixed results, as Butte had a long history of independent unionism, and many miners did not trust the IWW. But the Butte police and mine owners had no tolerance for this radical. His allies told Little to flee, but he refused. 6 masked men came to his hotel room, tied him up, took him to the edge of town, beat him, and hanged him from a railroad trestle. A few days after Little's lynching, Montana declared martial law against war opponents, rounded up radicals of all stripes, and engaged in a massive state-sponsored violation of civil liberties. No one was ever charged for Little's murder. 54 When Butte miners struck in September 1918, the Army raided the IWW Hall and other miners' union halls, beat and arrested strike leaders, and banned the printing of union newspapers. Similar repression took place in the forests. The IWW led a 1917 strike that convinced many employers to improve the housing and sanitation in the camps and to institute the 8th Day. When it threatened a new wave of strikes to begin on May 1, 1918, the government formed a squadron of soldier loggers called the Spruce Production Division to acquire the wood needed to build airplanes, militarizing the forest. The Army then created a government-sponsored paramilitary company union. The Loyal Legion of Loggers and Lumbermen banned IWW membership for any logger wanting a job but also cleaned up the sanitation and food in the camps, which had spurred the organizing. IWW membership shriveled in the face of both repression and of the government granting much of what rank-and-file loggers demanded. 55 The violence against the IWW was part of the larger Red Scare. The government defined criticism of the war as a treasonous act. Wilson signed the Espionage Act in June 1917 and the Sedition Act in May 1918, which cracked down on dissent, banning radical publications from the mail and allowing for the imprisonment of people who spoke out against the war. Immigrant radicals such as Emma Goldman were arrested and deported to the Soviet Union. Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs was arrested, charged with sedition, and sentenced to 10 years in prison after giving a speech urging resistance to the draft. A frequent Socialist Party candidate for president, he ran for the presidency again in 1920, this time from prison, receiving over 900,000 votes. Workers went on strike in record numbers in 1919, and workers in Seattle even went on a massive general strike that shut down the city. Most of these workers did not adhere to radical ideologies, and many of the year's strikes revolved around how inflation of consumer prices seriously challenged the ability of working people to feed and clothe themselves in the aftermath of World War I.56. Yet repression was the response, especially against the IWW. Federal agents and mobs raided IWW offices. Violent mobs tarred and feathered individual Wobblies. The government indicted 166 Wobblies for subversion. Local elites used the vigilante atmosphere to crush African American labor organizing as well, including in 1919. Massacre of black sharecroppers organizing for justice in Elaine, Arkansas, that killed between 25 and several hundred African Americans. In some places, the Wobblies marched on, such as leading the largest strike in the history of the Port of Philadelphia in 1920, but when it failed after 6 weeks, it gave employers the upper hand and they crushed the rare truly interracial union through a 1922 lockout. In Centralia, Washington, a small logging town, the American Legion decided to celebrate the first anniversary of Armistice Day in 1919 by raiding the IWW Hall. The Wobblies fought back and killed 4 invaders. That night, the Legionnaires lynched Wobbly organizer Wesley Everest from a bridge. 8 other Wobblies were sentenced to long prison terms of up to 40 years. The remaining Wobblies focused on getting the class war prisoners out of prison, but the last did not leave until 1937.57. The industrial workers of the world never brought about their revolution. Despite the IWW's internal problems, the state's intolerance for even moderate challenges to employer authority, not to mention those fighting to overthrow capitalism, meant that these radicals never had a chance to create the idealized world they sought. But the IWW provided hope and organizing expertise to workers who had none. It organized across the nation's racial divisions like no union had done before. It took on the most oppressive employers and sometimes won. The IWW advanced a radical critique of American capitalism that influenced another generation of radicals to come. It played a critical role in teaching American workers how to use radical ideas to advance an agenda that effectively challenged capitalism, laying the groundwork for the working class of the next generation to finally win dignity and respect.